Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, and we do appreciate your work. The Committee on Financial Services will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Members of the House who are not on the full committee are authorized to participate fully in today's hearing, and members of the local media who are invited to this hearing may engage in audio and visual coverage of the committee's proceedings. I would like to remind all here that any recording of today's proceedings is solely to educate, enlighten, and inform the general public on an accurate and impartial basis of the committee's operations and consideration of legislative issues, as well as developing an understanding and perspective on the House of Representatives and its role in our government. This coverage may not be used for any partisan, political campaign purpose or be made available for such purpose. Finally, I want to welcome today's audience to this hearing, which we will be conducting under the rules of the House of Representatives and the Committee on Financial Services. This hearing is entitled, Examining the Homelessness Crisis in Los Angeles. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. So again, good morning to everyone. Welcome to the Committee on Financial Services field hearing, again entitled, Examining the Homelessness Crisis in Los Angeles. This is our first full committee field hearing of the 116th Congress. I would like to thank the California African American Museum and, of course, the executive director that you just met, George O. Davis, for hosting today's hearing. As chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee, I have made it a top priority to focus on homelessness. We're in a national homelessness crisis. Earlier this year, I convened the first ever full committee hearing on homelessness, and today we will continue our discussion by examining the homelessness crisis in Los Angeles and the federal, state, and local responses to address this great challenge that is in our city and that is facing our nation. According to the latest point-in-time count, both the city and county of Los Angeles experienced a 12 to 16% increase from last year in the number of people that are homeless, experiencing homelessness. On any given night, we have nearly 60,000 people in the county, while over 35,000 people experience homelessness right here in the city. I'm describing some of our most vulnerable neighbors, including families with children, seniors, and unaccompanied youth. We cannot ignore that our homelessness crisis is directly linked to the affordable housing crisis. Too many people cannot afford to keep a roof over their heads, as wages have not kept pace with rising rents. Los Angeles has one of the least affordable housing markets in the United States. In LA County, a renter earning the minimum wage of $13.25 an hour would need to work 79 hours a week in order to afford a two-bedroom apartment. As a result, approximately 721,000 households in the county are severely rent burdened, meaning that they pay more than 50% of their income on rent. We need a bold and comprehensive response at the federal, state, and local level to address the homelessness crisis. That's why I have introduced this bill, the Ending Homelessness Act, legislation that would provide over $13 billion in funding to ensure every person experiencing homelessness in America has a place to call home. The Financial Services Committee passed this legislation earlier this year, and I am committed to doing everything I can to get this bill passed into law. Both the county and city are working hard to combat the homelessness and affordable housing crisis. Thanks to voters approving local ballot measures in 2016 and 2017, the city and county have robust new resources to fund initiatives that improve the lives of people experiencing homelessness. Proposition HHH has helped fund the development of thousands of new permanent supportive housing units. And so far, funding from Measure H has helped 14,000 people find housing. However, much more needs to be done, including passing legislation like the Ending Homelessness Act into law at the federal level. Today, we will receive testimony from representatives of the county and city, including Mayor Garcetti, who will testify on our third panel. We will also hear from housing and service providers who are on the ground every day delivering critical services to people experiencing homelessness. So I would like to thank our committee members who are in attendance here today. And I'm so very pleased to have with us Representative Al Green, all the way from Texas, Houston, Texas. Representative Silva Garcia is here also from Houston, Texas. Please welcome her. And of course, I would like to thank the members of the California delegation who are not on the committee who are here today. Representatives Nanette Barragan, Representative Jimmy Gomez, Representative Judy Chu. And we're looking forward to be joined by Representative Brad Sherman. Give him a round of applause anyway. And so I look forward to hearing the witnesses' testimony. Today we have three panels, and I want to welcome the first panel for today's hearing. Our first panel of distinguished witnesses are Cristina Miller, the Deputy Mayor for the City of Los Angeles Homeless Initiatives. That is the Office of the Mayor of the City of Los Angeles. Peter Lynn, Executive Director, Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority. Margarita Larez, Chief Program Officer, Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles. Monique King-Veland, Executive Director, Los Angeles County Development Authority, and Kevin Murray, former state senator and president and CEO, the Weingarten Center. Phil Ansell, Director, Los Angeles County Homeless Initiative. And without objection, we're going to take their written statements to be part of the record. Each of you will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. I will give you a signal by tapping the gavel lightly when 1 minute remains. At that time, I would ask you to wrap up your testimony so we can be respectful of both the witnesses and the committee members' time. And so, before recognizing first Ms. Miller, let me just say that there are other elected officials who have joined us here today, and I would like all of the other elected officials who are in the audience to please stand. Ms. Miller, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Waters and esteemed members of the committee. My name is Cristina Miller, and I serve as Deputy Mayor of Los Angeles under the leadership of Mayor Eric Garcetti. Chairwoman, I want to begin by commending your leadership by introducing the Ending Homelessness Act. While the crisis is not as acute in most cities as it is here in Los Angeles, this is undoubtedly a pervasive issue nationally. It is one that has impacted big cities especially, but also rural areas, and has left many families and individuals without the basic need of a safe place to live and thrive. That is unacceptable. The only way we find our way out of this crisis is together. With decades of disinvestment from the state and federal government amounting to nearly $500 million per year on average, we need your help to make lasting progress. Here in Los Angeles, we find ourselves in a bit of a paradox. We are seen as national leaders with the best suite of interventions to combat homelessness, yet our numbers increased last year by 12% countywide, and the scale of our crisis is daunting. It is fair to say that most average Angelenos, it is hard to feel that progress is being made. It is also fair to say that we can't get to everyone living on the streets fast enough. So the question becomes, how does a city and a county with so many resources, with strong committed leaders and a solid strategic plan, have one of the largest homeless populations of any city in America? The answer is twofold. First, that while we have made tremendous progress in just a few short years to outreach, provide services, and place our homeless neighbors into housing, this effort only began in earnest a few short years ago, and the homelessness crisis in LA has been in the making for decades. Secondly, it was especially put into focus for all of us this year as our homeless count numbers increased despite record housing placement numbers, almost 22,000 people countywide. That homelessness is a symptom of a much larger macro issue in our region and across America. Our homelessness crisis is our affordable housing crisis. Homelessness has, among other things, become the most extreme expression of poverty as the wealth divide grows deeper and more acute. So investing in our homeless service system alone won't solve this crisis. Concurrently, we must address the feeder systems into homelessness and increase affordable housing options for people to exit to. Let me shift to telling you about the city's response to homelessness. This year, City of Los Angeles homelessness budget amounts to $462 million. That's 25 times the homelessness budget in 2015, with 2/3 of spending going towards permanent housing. As you mentioned, our HHH housing bond of $1.2 billion with the goal of housing 10,000 people over the course of 10 years. Through an action-oriented partnership with the county, LAHSA, and philanthropy, the city is focused on a response that can be broken down into 3 areas: preventing homelessness, reducing street homelessness, and increasing and preserving affordable and supportive housing. Additionally, for the first time ever, the city has a place-based strategy in Skid Row, the epicenter of the region's crisis. I'll touch on homelessness prevention first. This is a key part of our regional strategy. The city's largest anti-poverty program is the Family Source Centers, where a multitude of services are co-located at 16 centers citywide, and a range of services from legal supports, employment, and financial counseling are delivered. We also have the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, which puts a limit on rent increases and requires just cause evictions. The best way to prevent homelessness is to keep people in their current homes. So, in addition, the city is scaling up an eviction defense program that provides tenancy rights, education, landlord mediation services, and legal representation if needed. Secondly, I'll touch on our street strategy and interim housing efforts. With 3 out of 4 people living unsheltered in Los Angeles, more than any other city in America, our work to address health and safety issues in encampments has to be balanced and coordinated with our field-based outreach and services response to navigating people to housing and shelter. We coordinate these efforts through a unified homelessness response center. It's a physical space where city leadership from departments are co-located and make real-time decisions on how to respond to the complex operational picture on the ground. While we work to mitigate issues of cleanliness and health in encampments, the ultimate goal is to get people off the streets for good. Here we leveraged the army of outreach workers expanded to 800 countywide to get households into bridge and permanent housing. Simply put, people live on the streets because we don't have enough indoor places for them to be. To address that, through the mayor's A Bridge Home initiative, the city is standing up 26 new interim housing projects that will yield over 2,000 beds total. We have 5 projects open so far, yielding 247 beds. This is the biggest shelter capital program in the nation. Third, to touch on our housing efforts. In order to meet the needs of our most vulnerable homeless Angelenos, the $1.2 billion Prop HHH loan program has led to the city more than tripling its existing supportive housing pipeline, with 110 projects and over 7,400 units on their way to people living on the streets and in other circumstances, putting us on track to meet the goal to build 10,000 units of supportive housing by 2026. We've also created the city's first inclusionary zoning program, the Affordable Housing Linkage Fee, which mandates the inclusion of affordable housing in market rate developments or payment of a fee to capitalize our affordable housing programs. We've also enhanced our land use incentives through the Transit-Oriented Communities Program and Measure JJJ, which will work in tandem with the linkage fee, resulting in more mixed income developments. We are strongly advocating for tenant rights in Sacramento and supporting tenant protection laws like AB 1482 on the state level. It's an anti-rent gouging and rent cap law, and an anti-discrimination law for rental assistance program. We are also firmly committed to innovation. Finally, the city has a place-based strategy for the first time ever in Skid Row. Emergency state dollars in the amount of $20 million have been put forth to address the immediate, short-term, medium-term, and long-term needs. Thank you so much. That is just a snapshot of what the city is doing to address homelessness.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lynn, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee, members of the LA delegation, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to testify this morning, and I have to say that it's much nicer to address you as Madam Chair, then Madam Ranking Member. I'd like to cover a few of the recent data on homelessness and also some of the trends that brought us here and some of the paths out of homelessness. Last year, as you indicated, there's a 12% increase in homelessness in LA County, meaning nearly 59,000 Angelenos are homeless on any given night. 75% of them, as Deputy Mayor indicated, are unsheltered. This is reflecting the statewide crisis in homelessness. Of my colleagues in other continuums, the other 43 continuums across the state, 3/4 of them showed an increase in homelessness this year. And that increase was greater than the count that we saw in Los Angeles, largely due to the interventions that you mentioned that the voters put in service to house people out of homelessness in LA. But the count only tells a snapshot. It's a moment in time. Our data indicate that in addition to the 59,000 people we counted, 55,000 more people fell into homelessness over the course of 2018. So over 107,000 people experienced homelessness over the course of the year. That's a flow into homelessness of about 150 people a day. The interventions that we were able to deploy, and as the Deputy Mayor indicated, they are among the most robust in the country. We were able to house 133 people out of homelessness on a daily basis. But that gap led to the increase, and that gap is primarily driven by housing affordability. At root cause, this is a crisis of housing affordability. Los Angeles is the most populous county in America. We would be the 10th largest state, were we a state, and we have the least affordable housing market in the United States by multiple measures. More than a third of LA renters pay more than 50% of their income for rent. That is an extraordinary number of extremely low-income people hanging on by their fingertips. They're one medical issue, one car repair from homelessness on a daily basis. If we neglect to address the root cause of housing affordability, and the California Housing Partnership indicates that we have a gap of 517,000 units of affordability in the County of Los Angeles, we will not get ahead of this crisis, no matter how effective our interventions. I also want to indicate very clearly that we cannot address homelessness without simultaneously addressing structural and institutional racism in America. It is a core driver for the homeless crisis that we have, and there are radical disproportionalities in race in the distribution of people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles and in the United States. 35% of the people who experience homelessness here are black. That is against a county population of 8% African American. The drivers for that are represent a multitude of things. I'd like to call out in particular the history of racial segregation in federal policy that drove to deep housing segregation in this county through redlining and across the nation. Federal policy instituted redlining, instituted housing segregation, and HUD policy enforced it for decades in the 20th century. As American households were building wealth through household ownership, that was exclusively reserved for white households. African Americans were blocked out of home ownership through those programs, and the wealth building of the 20th century that occurred left African American households with 1/10 of the wealth of white households in this country. That is a major driver for homelessness. There is no fallback for many, many African American households. In addition, our criminal justice system over-polices and over-incarcerates African Americans, African American communities, and that racial disparity in incarceration has led to severe overrepresentation in our criminal justice system. In the County of Los Angeles, of 8% people of color, 8% black people in the County of Los Angeles, 30% of our jail population are black. Those drivers leave people with severe economic disparities and capacities within our market, in our housing market, our job market, and every other aspect of our culture. Those have to be addressed if we're going to get to the root cause of addressing homelessness in the United States. There are a number of resources that the federal government has constrained over the last few years, CDBG and home funding being particularly notable as reductions of significant reductions over the last few years. But the fundamental formulas that distributed the core federal housing program, housing programs that address affordability, were not fair. California was shortchanged. We in the Los Angeles County have 11,000 units of public housing, compared to New York City, with 170,000 units of public housing. So not only is our rent high and our incomes low, we do not have the affordability mechanisms like Section 8 in public housing that New York has. I want to thank you, Chairwoman, for the opportunity to address this panel.
And thank you very much. Ms. Lowrys, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you, members of the Committee on Financial Services. Thank you, members of the Committee on Financial Services, for inviting the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles to provide a written testimony and to speak today regarding the humanitarian crisis in Los Angeles. Thank you for introducing H.R. 1856, the Ending Homelessness Act of 2019. A special recognition to Congresswoman and Chair of the Committee, Maxine Waters, for being a strong, vocal, and persistent champion for our community. HACLA supports H.R. 1856 so that communities with the highest need, like Los Angeles, receive the appropriate resource. This is both the most effective and efficient use of scarce federal funding. HACLA further supports the concept that priority for federal assistance should be given to communities in which local governments, like Los Angeles, have adopted policies to aid in ending and preventing homelessness. The Los Angeles community has stepped to the plate by taking a collective approach in building and preserving affordable housing, committing ongoing rental assistance, and increasing supportive services. This commitment was further solidified when the voters of Los Angeles approved Proposition Triple H in the city and Measure H in the county. While we believe that local governments and organizations must play a part in the solution, we need the federal government to be a partner in this effort. For 10 years, HACLA has taken on the battle to end homelessness and to preserve affordable housing by using federal rental subsidies such as the Section 8 Housing Choice Vouchers. HACLA has implemented policies giving priority to veterans, homeless families, youth, and individuals, and committed vouchers for permanent supportive housing, which has led to 19,500 rental subsidies being utilized to house formerly homeless households. Without this assistance, the count of homeless individuals would be today greater. Continuing in this effort, in 2017, following the passing of Triple H and H by Los Angeles voters, HACLA committed an additional 5,000 project-based vouchers for permanent supportive housing. Within 2 years, HACLA will be utilizing nearly 40% of its resources to house people experiencing homelessness. Besides the 36,165 people experiencing homelessness in the city, based on the 2019 point-in-time count, there are 18,000 households on the voucher wait list. In October of 2017, when HACLA opened a wait list for vouchers, 188,000 households registered for assistance, but the number had to be reduced to 20,000 via lottery process. There are also 51,000 households registered on the wait list for public housing. At minimum, 250,000 households are looking to HACLA for hope. Clearly, HACLA cannot keep up with the demand without additional resources from the federal government. HACLA needs more vouchers, but with appropriate funding levels for the Los Angeles area. HACLA is expending 100% of its federal budget authority, but only able to utilize 93% of the vouchers. Average rental payments have increased by 20% over the last 4 years because of continued increases in the rental market, while the income of voucher holders have dropped or remained the same. The average annual income for voucher program participants is $16,953 or $1,412 per month. Yet, the 2019 HUD published fair market rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles is $1,384 per month. The reality is that rental costs are high and incomes are low. With less than 3% availability in rental units, the success rate in finding a place to live has dropped to 53% for households with a voucher. This is especially heartbreaking for individuals that have been unsheltered or waited years on the wait list for a voucher, only to return the voucher or have it expire. HACLA's inability to utilize 100% of its vouchers is having a negative financial impact on the agency. The Housing Authority funds its program operations with federally provided administrative fees for each voucher. With the drop of voucher utilization from 100 to 93%, HACLA is now receiving less administrative dollars. The loss of revenue is further compounded when only 79% of the determined fees required to properly administer the program are received due to a proration factor. While the focus of H.R. 1856 is on ending homelessness, it is also important to support affordable housing for all who need it. Homeless prevention is a vital piece, as the homeless problem will continue to grow if the number of people becoming homeless grows faster than we can house them. As you are aware, permanent supportive housing is the most appropriate for people experiencing homelessness and to prevent recidivism. New permanent supportive housing needs the operating support from a Section 8 voucher to work. HACLA is rapidly reaching its limits of vital Section 8 assistance, and additional allocation of vouchers from the federal government would make it feasible for HACLA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. King. Velan, please go right ahead.
Good morning, Chairwoman Waters and honorable representatives. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this homelessness crisis. I dare say the most critical humanitarian crisis facing the County of Los Angeles. The LACDA is resolute in our mission to build better lives and better neighborhoods, as well as our commitment to end generational poverty and homelessness. Using a combination of local, state, and federal resources, we administer several programs that provide housing opportunities for lower-income families, the elderly, the disabled, youth transitioning out of foster care, and individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Moreover, as the second-largest public housing agency in Southern California, we administer several federally funded programs that help in our efforts to combat homelessness, including Section 8, Continuum of Care, and VASH, providing rental assistance for approximately 25,000 families. And in light of the magnitude of the homelessness crisis, we recognize the need to take a bold step and use all of the resources at our disposal to meet the crisis head-on, and therefore created a homeless preference that dedicates 100% of our Section 8 turnover vouchers to house homeless Angelenos. We created partnerships with the 18 other housing authorities operating in the county to align our policies and streamline access. And we leveraged local resources to develop creative, flexible solutions that restricted federal dollars did not allow. For example, we created the Homeless Incentive Program, or HIP, to remove barriers to access for our voucher holders that were finding it next to impossible to use their voucher to secure a unit. HIP allows us to engage property owners to secure their rental units in exchange for a monetary incentive, while qualified renters with a voucher are referred to the owner. We also assist clients with funding to pay for security deposits, utility fees, and move-in expenses. Further, each client receives access to county-funded intensive case management services to help with the transition and ongoing supportive services as necessary. The LACDA administered approximately $18 million in the first 2 years of Measure H, and these resources helped over 1,900 individuals and families come home. Additionally, we leveraged our partnerships to expand this program, which now supports 8 other PHAs in the county who have replicated HIP, leading to an additional 825 individuals and families housed over the same period. We also provide capital funding and rental assistance for the creation of new affordable housing. Over the past 5 years, the county has provided $294 million in capital subsidy for the development of affordable housing, leveraging $2.3 billion in public and private funds that created more than 4,200 affordable units in the pipeline, 2/3 of which will serve special needs populations. This year alone, we will fund 5 times the number of units we funded just 5 years ago. However, recognizing that we cannot build our way out of the crisis, several actions have been taken by the county to keep residents housed. For example, the Board of Supervisors passed a temporary rent stabilization ordinance in effect until December 2019. The board also passed a source of income demonstration ordinance in April of this year, barring owners from disqualifying a prospective tenant solely based on their source of income, like a rental subsidy. Despite these creative solutions, and while an unprecedented number of affordable and supportive units are in construction and being funded, the inflow, due to a myriad of institutional and systemic issues, racial and social class disparities, lack of economic growth and mobility, continues to conflate our efforts. We look to our elected officials for actions to help address the crisis. We request support in sustaining or increasing funding for vital federal programs, providing administrative flexibilities, allowing for regional waivers, and redistributing of unused housing choice voucher funding. In closing, the activities outlined in this testimony, as well as the more detailed written testimony, are indicative of the forward-thinking, collaborative approach that has fueled our fight, and it is a fight, to end homelessness. The solution to these problems are varied and complex, but one thing is clear: we cannot do it without significant investment from all levels of government. And the funding proposed in the Ending Homelessness Act of 2019, introduced by Chairwoman Waters, is an excellent example of the type of federal investment needed to combat this crisis. Again, the LACDA stands resolute in our mission to build better lives and better neighborhoods. Thank you for the invitation to address this urgent matter.
Thank you very much, Ms. King of Elan. Senator Murray, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and the committee, for holding this hearing on what I also believe is one of the most crucial issues we face today. It is maybe the civil rights issue of our time. For reasons stated previously on this panel, one of our main sources of providing a safety net to its citizens is to solve this problem. One of the things about homelessness policy is that it's essentially the Rorschach test of policy issues. If you are a affordable housing advocate, that's the driving force. If you are a mental health advocate, that's the driving force. If you are a civil rights advocate, that's the driving force. If you are a criminal justice reform person, that's the driving source of our problem for homelessness. The fact is, it is all of those things. And one of the things I want to urge the committee to do is resist the temptation to find and fund a single silver bullet. Our current housing first model, I think, goes in that direction. The rise of housing first has also taken away funding for transitional housing. The Weingart Center now houses about 600 people a night right on the corner of 6th and San Pedro in Skid Row. We've had to transition from a transitional housing operation to a shelter and bridge housing operation. What that has taken away is it has taken away the funding for life skills and other skills that even if you put a homeless individual into permanent housing, you have not necessarily given them the life skills to become a good neighbor. So again, I would argue to the committee and respectfully request the committee to look at this solution, that we find as many solutions as there are for types of people who have gone into homelessness and where they come from, and that one size does not fit all. You know, some of the things we also don't fund are family reunification and shared housing and roommates, and now we, as some of you who have been foster care advocates know, now we actually fund family foster care. We do not fund for someone to rent a room at a family member's house. Our model is strictly build a unit, roughly a 250 square foot unit with a bathroom and a kitchen, and try and put a person in that unit. Sometimes those people don't want to leave their community, the location where they are. Sometimes they just don't like the rules that come from those things. And then if they don't take that, we put them temporarily in a shelter where most of the clients, frankly, do not want to go into shelters. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to find a multitude of solutions and fund all of those. They do exist, but our model kind of stifles that innovation. Again, for instance, the county has a flexible housing pool. There are flexible programs, but the overwhelming majority of the projects that happen in this area are 250 square foot studio apartments. And there are people who need different types of support. And I think that, again, I want to emphasize, this should be a multimodal approach. The other thing, which as someone who operates right on Skid Row on the ground, we do need to aggressively enforce laws against those who prey on the homeless. Right now on Skid Row, there are criminal gangs who are literally charging people for a place on the sidewalk. So one of the things that we have to do, and I understand that our views on criminal justice are not to necessarily be aggressive on Skid Row, but we have to find a way to make this differentiation because we are leaving people out on the street to be preyed upon. The next thing we need to do is we need to find humane but more aggressive ways to deal with the service resistant. The fact is there are people who are service resistant for a variety of reasons. It's not all mental health, it's not all substance abuse. Sometimes, frankly, it's very rational decisions that they make on their part. But we need to be aggressive about that. And finally, I would like to say that Los Angeles taxpayers should be rewarded for taxing themselves to help solve the homeless crisis. My last couple.
One moment, Mr. Murray. We appreciate the enthusiasm, but would you please refrain from interrupting the presenters? Thank you. Go right ahead, wind up, Mr. Murray.
The taxpayers have voted to invest billions, literally billions of dollars, and the federal government should recognize that and leverage that money to help us meet this problem. And finally, the Proposition Triple H and Proposition H expect to build roughly 10,000 units of permanent supportive housing, which I support as one of the solutions. The fact is, before we get to 10,000, we will run out of Section 8 vouchers to fund the revenue for those projects.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Senator Murray, thank you very much. Mr. Ansell, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members. My name is Phil Ansell. I'm the director of the Los Angeles County Homeless Initiative. And I'm delighted to testify before you today regarding a countywide movement to prevent and combat homelessness, which was catalyzed by the Board of Supervisors in August of 2015, when they stepped forward and accepted a mantle of countywide leadership to combat this crisis. In the first 6 months of the County Homeless Initiative, we brought together 400 invited government and community experts in 18 policy summits to generate, on a consensus basis, a countywide comprehensive plan to prevent and combat homelessness. And in February of 2016, 47 comprehensive strategies were unanimously approved by the Board of Supervisors. And on that same day, the Los Angeles City Council adopted the first ever Los Angeles City Comprehensive Homeless Strategy, a testament to the deep and new collaboration between the city and county of Los Angeles in combating homelessness. At that time, the Board of Supervisors approved $100 million in one-time county funding to jumpstart implementation of the strategies, and at the same time identified the need for an ongoing source of funding, because an ongoing problem cannot be effectively addressed with one-time funding. In March of 2017, Los Angeles County voters, somewhat miraculously, in an off-year low turnout election, by a margin of 70%, approved Measure H, a 1/4% special sales tax generating an estimated $355 million annually for 10 years, legally dedicated to preventing and combating homelessness. We told the voters that in the first 5 years of Measure H, we would help 45,000 family members and individuals move from homelessness into permanent housing. And in fact, in the first 21 months of Measure H supported services and rental subsidies, from July 2017 through March of 2019, we helped 14,241 individuals and family members move from homelessness into permanent housing. We are on track to meet our goal of 45,000. And in that same 21-month period, Measure H helped over 28,000 family members and individuals move into interim housing. However, as you've heard, despite this extraordinary effort by an extraordinary movement, a movement that has doubled the number of family members and individuals moving from homelessness into permanent housing since 2015, the number of people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles County rose between January 2018 and January 2019 by 12%. Now, as has been noted, our neighboring counties in Southern California and the urban counties in the California Bay Area all experienced much larger increases, typically 20 to 40% increases over the same period of time, Without Measure H, we would have experienced similarly large increases. The fundamental problem is inflow. As noted earlier in 2018, 133 family members and individuals every day move from homelessness into permanent housing. But every day, 150 people became homeless. That difference, 17 more people per day becoming homeless than exiting homelessness, accounts for that increase in our homeless population. The fundamental reason for that increase is economic. People are unable to pay the rent in a housing market governed by the law of supply and demand, where we have such a severe shortage of affordable housing that rents are increasing in such a way that it is both in forcing people who are currently renting out of their homes and making it impossible for low-income households to secure new rental housing which they can afford. As was previously mentioned, we are in a paradoxical situation in Los Angeles County. Just 2 days ago, the Los Angeles Times ran a headline that said that communities across the United States look to Los Angeles County as a beacon of effective practice in combating homelessness. And yet, after the city of New York, we have the largest homeless population in the United States. This paradox is attributable to inflow. We are bailing more water out of the homeless boat than ever before, but the hole in the bottom of our boat is so large that there is more water seeping into our boat. Congresswoman Waters' H.R. 1856 exemplifies the sort of bold, major action we need from the federal government to partner with us in the 88 cities, the County of Los Angeles, and our hundreds of community and faith-based partners as part of this countywide movement to bring our homeless neighbors home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce to you, I think, two of our members from the Los Angeles County delegation that have joined us. Ms. Grace Napolitano is here. And we've just been joined by Congressman Brad Sherman. I now will recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I'm going to go first back to you, Mr. Ansell. You described very well what was happening in the County of Los Angeles. I want to know more information about Measure H that was passed in 2017. Now, I think it is important for everyone to understand that we do have funding from the federal government for all of the United States of America, and that's through the McKinney-Vento funds. So you get an allocation just as the city does. In addition to that, I was just looking up how much money you received from the McKinney-Vento grants that we send out to all of our states. So in addition to that, you have the Measure H, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you said Measure H is what, 100 million, is it?
No, Congresswoman, Measure H is generating an estimated $355 million annually.
355. Will you describe to us exactly how the $355 million is being spent? I thank you for the general overview of what the needs are, but now you have started to apply that funding to various efforts of the county. Exactly what are they?
Certainly, Congresswoman, thank you for the question. The Measure H ordinance adopted by the Board of Supervisors in November of 2016 specified 21 specific strategies for which Measure H funding can be utilized. And in the spring of 2017, a group of 50 government and community stakeholders develop consensus recommendations to the Board of Supervisors regarding the utilization of that Measure H funding across those 21 strategies for the first 3 years. The strategies for which most Measure H funding is being utilized include homelessness prevention for single adults and family members, disability benefits advocacy to assist homeless disabled adults to secure supplemental security income and veterans disability benefits.
Excuse me, if I may, I do understand the overall strategy
Yes,
and
ma'am.
what you say was adopted. Can you be more specific about any monies that have been spent on a project or an effort of some kind?
Yes, ma'am, certainly. The two largest categories of Measure H expenditures are for permanent housing and interim housing.
So have you constructed, built, developed permanent housing?
We only utilize Measure H for capital construction to a very limited degree.
Okay, so most of your money is spent on supportive services?
Actually, rental subsidies and the associated
How much money
services.
have you spent on rental subsidies?
In the prior year, we spent over $100 million
Does that come from the
From Measure
federal
H.
funding or from H?
for Measure H.
How much money again?
Over $100 million for rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, both rental subsidies
How
and
do
the
you
associated
spend
services.
the permanent supportive housing money? Do you cooperate with the city of Los Angeles, for example, who may be building low-income housing, permanent housing? Do you coordinate with them in order to provide the money for the supportive services?
Yes, absolutely. In fact,
Give me an example of that.
The county has a memorandum of understanding with the city of Los Angeles where we've committed to provide intensive case management services for the tenants in 10,000 units of permanent supportive housing, which the city of Los Angeles is committed to creating over this decade, including the units funded through Proposition Triple H. So the basic model, Congresswoman, is that we use Measure H to pay for the services, and where necessary, the rental subsidy. The city funds capital, and we also use other county funding other than Measure H for the capital costs of developing new permanent supportive housing. And then we couple Measure H for services with federal
Lastly,
rental
let me
subsidies.
just, if I may
with capital.
interrupt you, I think you said you do direct some of the Measure H money toward capital,
Only a very small portion.
a small portion. Again, most of it is supportive services
And rental subsidies.
and rental subsidies. And you've spent exactly, again, if you would reiterate how much you've spent on rental subsidies. Who did it go to, and what is the criteria for that?
So in the past fiscal year, we spent over $100 million
Okay.
of Measure H for rental subsidies and services in two categories. For permanent supportive housing, we provide ongoing services, and where necessary, use Measure H to pay the rental subsidy.
If you would explain to me quickly, who qualifies for rental subsidies? Who gets that money?
For permanent, we have a coordinated entry system, which, as required by the federal government, which we use to match homeless families, youth, and individuals to permanent housing resources. So for permanent supportive housing, it is those persons who are the most vulnerable and have the highest acuity under our assessment tool. For rapid rehousing, which is a time-limited rental subsidy with time-limited services, we serve a range of families and adults experiencing homelessness.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Al Green from Texas, who is also the chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the witnesses for appearing as well. Madam Chair, I am proud to say that I am a person who supports your bill, the Ending Homelessness Act. And here's why. The senator is eminently correct. This is bigger than any one single crisis. It's an affordable housing crisis. It's a living wage crisis, a mental health crisis, a substance abuse crisis, an incarceration crisis, and it is also an invidious discrimination crisis. It really is comparable to a disaster. It is a disaster that is unnatural. For our natural disasters, we spend untold amounts of money. Katrina, over $100 billion. Harvey, over $100 billion. This bill is $13.3 billion, and it takes a holistic approach to dealing with this unnatural disaster. So, Madam Chair, I'm grateful that you have this bill, and if I may, I'd just like to ask the panel, are you familiar with this bill? If you are, would you kindly extend a hand into the air? Those who are familiar, you all are. Do you believe that this bill is a part of the solution to the crisis? If so, would you raise your hand, please? I'd like to know now, I always like to build a record, what about the LGBTQ community? There was not a mention of the crisis with young people who happen to be LGBTQ. I have information indicating that approximately 40% of the young people who are on the street homeless are a member of the LGBTQ community. Anyone have any additional information that you can share on this topic? Mr. Lynn?
Representative Green, the data that we have locally would indicate that the number is less than that, but substantially greater than the general population. The prevalence of both youth who do not identify as male or female, there's a non-binary youth, transgender youth, and LGBT youth represent about a quarter of the youth in our population who are homeless. So, but it's a tremendous overrepresentation against the general population prevalence, and I think these youth are at particular vulnerability. There's a number of reasons why they may not fit in at home and may not feel welcome or may not be safe. And fleeing violence is one of the main reasons for this population in particular to end up homeless. We do have programs that specifically target that. I would like to call the attention of the committee to the equal access rule rollback that HUD has proposed. I think it is expected to come out in September, but this is a very damaging proposal. HUD had moved the nation forward in addressing the rights and access of the transgender community in our shelter inventory and required all communities to provide equal access. That rule is being rolled back, and that will have devastating and life-threatening consequences for our trans youth and trans adults nationally.
Here's what I'd like to do. I have a staffer with me today, and I'll make sure that that staffer visits with you, after this hearing. Let me move quickly to criminal records. I was a small claims court judge for a while, justice court judge, and I understand how people acquire criminal records for penalties that require a fine only, and they go to jail not because of the fine initially, but because they don't show up in court to pay the fine that they don't have the funds to pay it with. And I'm just curious as to the number of people on the street simply because of who are homeless because of the inability to pay a fine or because they were at some point charged with failure to appear in court.
Sir, we don't have data specifically on
Could you come
a
little bit closer to the microphone,
yes, sir.
please?
Sir, we don't have data specifically on that statistic. I will say that of the single adults who are unsheltered in our population, which is the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness in the County of Los Angeles, 63% have a history of incarceration in jail or prison. So there is a very large overrepresentation of people who are homeless, the people who have some degree of involvement with our criminal justice system. there are devastating consequences to any amount of incarceration, any amount, people lose time in their jobs, they get fired, people lose their apartments for not meeting those requirements, but I don't have specific data on the number of people who are homeless simply for failure to appear.
I'm abusing the time now. I will yield back, Madam Chair, and I'll make sure that we get with you. Would you provide something more for me in writing?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, I'll yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Sylvia Garcia from Texas, who is a member of the Financial Services Committee, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for your leadership and also welcoming us to your district. Your efforts in making homelessness a top priority for our committee is significant not only for this city but for cities across America. Your leadership in holding one of our first hearings about this subject and making sure the committee passed the Ending Homelessness Act as our first markup was monumental. I'm really here to listen today, and I appreciate from everyone their time here today and appreciate the moving personal stories along with policy recommendations that people are making. 2 weeks ago, I went to Detroit and learned about how the ripples from the financial and foreclosure crisis are still pushing people out of their homes, often illegally, 11 years after the Great Recession. Today, I'm learning about the unique challenges that Los Angeles is facing with homelessness up over the last year and over 58,000 residents in LA County. By comparison, in my area, that number is less than 4,000. Two big urban cities, big difference. This is a homeless problem that is much worse than what we face in Houston, obviously, but I want to understand what's driving this crisis and what are the best policy solutions. As a former social worker and also now as vice chair of the Majority Leader's Task Force on Urban Poverty, I know we need to focus on supporting wraparound services at the local level to fully address the immediate needs of people in the homeless cycle, while also looking at what structural reforms, as Mr. Lynn mentioned, we can make in our nation's economy so that we can make sure people aren't driven to homelessness in the first place. This committee and this Congress as a whole need to look not only at the short term, but more importantly, the long-term challenges ahead so that we can offer a basket of national policy options to make sure that every American city that faces this crisis can deal with it. So first, I want to start by saying that in my mind, the homeless issue and housing crisis in this country is a civil rights issue that we must tackle firsthand. I'd like to start this morning with asking Mr. Murray a question. Mr. Murray, I too am a former state senator, and I too, like you, worked on many of the issues that we're talking about here today. While I have not had a chance to fully visit your city, I did have the staff drive me by this Skid Row everybody keeps talking about. It's not anything like I've seen before, and I just wanted to ask you a question about this whole notion of wraparound services. What is the greatest need in our system today that we need to make sure that we put in place, not only in your city, but in cities across America who face the same challenges that Los Angeles does?
I think it's a variety of things, and I think it adjusts depending on the client, at least in my view. Down on the ground, we have shelter people who literally don't want any services and just want sustenance for that night, and you're not going to convince them, or it's very hard to convince them to take more. Then you have people that want to turn their lives around, and some of those people have severe mental health issues, some of those people have substance abuse issues. The other factor is that if they're on the street for more than a year, more than likely they have developed some sort of trauma which leads to a PTSD or some other kind of mental health services. So I would say if you were looking for a singular thing to make sure that we include in the wraparound services, it would be mental health services, but a variety of them. Some are going to be substance abuse, some are going to be PTSD, some are just going to be life skills. After you've been out on the street for years, sometimes you need some help just becoming a good neighbor so that you are more likely to thrive in your new housing placement.
Thank you. Ms. Lattis, are you familiar with the H.R. 2763, a bill I filed to challenge the proposed rulemaking from the current administration on, frankly, kicking out about 60,000 children across America out of public housing. It is my mixed status family bill. If you're familiar with it, what impact would it have on this city and this county?
I'm familiar with the proposed rules for both mixed families as well as the immigration proposed rules. I can share with you what the impact would be here in the city of Los Angeles in public housing. On the proposed bill for the mixed families, that would have impacted 11,000 individuals in both our public housing and Section 8 program. In the proposed immigration rule, that would impact 18,000. So these are two separate numbers potentially impacting more than 30,000 individuals in our households.
So if the regulation were put in place, how many of those would be children?
For the mixed family, a couple thousand. For the proposed immigration rule, we're talking about 3,000.
Are you talking about the public charge rule?
Public charge.
So both would have a severe impact on Los
Absolutely.
Angeles? Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Brad Sherman from the 30th District of California and who serves on the Financial Services Committee for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. The homeless issue is a combination of issues. Some are homeless because of substance abuse and psychological problems and trauma. Some are mostly homeless because the rent's too damn high. They can't afford it. And I'm going to focus on this panel on that second group, people who would be in an apartment if we had Wichita rents, but we have Los Angeles rents. And I'd say that this group of homeless people is just the tip of the iceberg. For every person sleeping in their car or sleeping in the park, there are 10 people who can barely afford their rent. There are 10 people who have an unlawful detainer that they're worried about, and they're at a payday lender trying to. There are 10 people who are cutting back on their medication so that they can pay their rent. There are 10 people sleeping on their friend's couch. We only see the folks that are absolutely homeless. But for so many people, the rent's too damn high. And it's a problem that we face in a number of big cities, but particularly here in Los Angeles. And some of it relates to relatively unique factors here. One is we're the biggest city in the world without a grade-separated rail system. So anytime you try to build something, the first reaction is not, that person is going to be with me on the train. No, that person's going to be in a car in front of me on the freeway. We've got NIMBYs who won't let you build, or people who think that my property values will go down unless the people who live near me are richer than I am. You've got the fiscalization of land use planning, where every city is told if you can attract an auto dealer, you get more money, and it costs you almost nothing. If you accommodate housing and that same property, you get no extra money for your city budget because the property tax goes elsewhere, and it's going to cost you some money for police and fire. But what I'm going to focus on here is impact fees. You want to build an apartment, and we need money to run the government. If we should tax people based on their ability to pay. We have something that does that. It's called the state income tax. Instead, in part, we're taxing people on their ability to build, and those costs are then passed through to tenants. Ms. Miller, LA Times had a headline, one reason housing is so expensive in California, counties and cities charge developer fees. Local impact fees impact whether a project gets built, and if the law of supply and demand, one of the few laws Congress cannot repeal, is operative. If we can get more supply, that will influence not only the people who live in that new unit, but it'll bring the supply demand cost down. What has LA done to mitigate impact fees as a barrier to development, particularly the development of low-income, affordable housing?
Yes, thank you for your question. I will start by saying the City of LA is committed to removing regulatory barriers to building housing at a cheaper rate and keeping costs low, particularly so they don't get passed on to tenants. If I can talk about 3 areas in which we are working to streamline the development of new housing here in the City of LA. The first thing I'll start with is the Mayor's Executive Directive 13. This is a streamlined measure that puts the building for any affordable housing project at essentially at the top of the line, and its aim.
Let me interrupt. I know you're talking about streamlining things. If somebody wants to build an apartment unit in the San Fernando Valley, how much of a fee is imposed per unit for them to be allowed to build that unit? What is the impact fee?
Sir, I can get that information to you more detailed in terms of the exact breakdown of what the fees are. What I can tell you is that through the streamlining measures...
And I do want to comment, I rarely do this to somebody. It's not that these fees will be passed on to the consumer, it's that the building won't be built. And then everybody will pay a higher rent because the supply of units will be down while the demand is still up. So you'll try to tell us what this fee is.
Certainly, we can have our Chief Housing Officer provide some more detailed information.
Please refrain from interrupting the questions and the responses.
What I can say is that there is a fee in which we are championing, in that because it promotes equitable building, and that is our affordable housing linkage fee. So there is an affordable housing linkage fee which ensures the private market builds equitably. It gives multifamily developers a choice. They can either include low-income units in their projects, or they can pay a fee into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is used to capitalize further and create more housing.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Judy Chu of the 27th District of California for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, thank you, Congressmember Waters, for holding this very, very important hearing, and also for your incredible leadership with your very important bill to combat homelessness. I'd like to address a question to Ms. Lardis. In Los Angeles County, we have housed unprecedented number of the homeless, but we've also still seen an increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness in LA County, which rose 12% last year. Now, in my area, the San Gabriel Valley, homelessness rates rose even faster, but I do have some positive news about one city in my district, which is the city of Pasadena, which saw a 20% decrease in its homeless count this year. And they attribute much of this progress to the success of permanent supportive housing. And they say that it provides stable housing to formerly homeless individuals and families, and offers services like employment training and health care on site. And the model can really work, as they have a near 100% retention rate amongst its residents. And of course, we have such incredible nonprofits like Union Station Services for the Homeless, which provide so many supportive services for the homeless. So, Ms. Lardis, you talked about permanent supportive housing. Why is this important, and how does it play a major role in combating homelessness, and what could the federal government do to increase it?
You are exactly correct. The City of Pasadena has used its Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher programs to project-based housing developments that provide permanent supportive housing, just as you described it. They've used every possible voucher available. My understanding is that they are reaching the caps. All the housing authorities are allowed to project-base 20% of their vouchers, and very recently an additional 10% under HOTMA for housing homeless individuals. So one big benefit, or one big ask that the housing authorities would have, is to increase the number of vouchers and also increase the caps that go along with it as well. That would certainly help all of our communities across the country.
Thank you for that. Senator Murray, I would like to talk to you about foster youth who are at heightened risk of homelessness and how the federal government can better serve them. In fact, I sit on the Ways and Means Committee on Worker and Family Support, which has jurisdiction over foster youth, and I am a member of the Congressional Caucus on Foster Youth. And in a recent survey from the organization Voices of Youth Count, 29% of 13 to 25-year-olds experience homelessness, and that they reported spending time in the child welfare system. So in your experience providing services to individuals and families at the Weingart Center, how can the federal government improve support for foster youth so that they don't experience homelessness?
Well, again, once they've gotten to us, they are already experiencing homelessness. But I think one of the things we can do is fund more specific things directed toward that age group. Both the county and LAHSA have specific transitional aged youth programs. In a previous life, as you may know, foster children and foster care was one of my big projects. But I think it even gets worse if you talk about transitional aged youth who are also LGBTQ, because they are particularly vulnerable out on the street. So just specific funding and specific mental health funding for their specific issues might, I think, help the problem. But we do have to bolster up, as we are talking about public policy matters which are not necessarily dealing with homeless, but dealing with the path to homelessness. You really need to invest some money on what do aged out youth in foster care go. The overwhelming majority of them, and I don't have the specifics at the tip of my fingertips, either enter the homeless system or the criminal justice system. And I think to the extent that when we put a child in foster care, and again, I spent some time in dependency court in my early career, when we put a kid into foster care, we become their parent, and we are just doing a horrible job of it based upon the numbers at foster care. So I think we ought to put some money into, when they're getting ready to age out, some transitional money for them so that they don't experience homelessness.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Nanette Barragan of the 44th District of California for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for your leadership on holding this hearing and for your bill on Ending Homelessness Act of 2019. I often hear when I'm in my congressional district and at town halls, what's going on, what is happening, how come this is getting worse, and why is it that the bills, the propositions that we've passed and taxing ourselves, why does it feel like it's not getting any better? And so it's a challenging question. And we've heard a little bit today about the progress that's being made. Maybe one of you can talk a little bit about what the chairwoman's bill will do. What kind of an impact will having her bill pass in helping address the homeless crisis that the city and the county of Los Angeles is facing? Ms. Miller, do you want to take this?
Sure, thank you. What I will start by saying is that we have spent the last few years building a system to respond to the crisis that is on the streets. And we are scaling that system up as we speak. What that system has told us is that there are 31,000 people in the system right now who have been engaged by an outreach worker. So more than likely, when your constituents see someone on the streets in an encampment, more than likely they have been touched by the system. There is some outreach worker somewhere providing services to them. They have had their needs assessed with our standardized assessment tool. They have gathered their documents needed to get into housing, whether it's income verification, a driver's license, an ID. They are ready to go. The problem is this bottleneck of not having enough housing for them to exit the system to. What we find similar in our shelter system, there are people ready to go. They have part-time jobs, they are engaged in services, they have mental health supports that they need, but there is no permanent destination for them to land. There's no affordable housing resource for them.
So, Ms. Miller, if you could just address what the chairwoman's bill would do, that influx of $13 billion, how would that help what you're trying to do?
Thank you so much. I would say the biggest gap that we have right now is a rental subsidy, is the ability to connect someone to an operating subsidy that they can then apply to a unit in the community and get them into housing. And I think the chairwoman's bill, with the set aside of resources for affordable housing, would be critical to getting a throughput in our system that we are lacking right now.
Thank you. You know, one of the things that we haven't mentioned is how Congressman Waters has been leading not just on this issue, but on the fight on the cuts that have been proposed. This president's fiscal year 2020 budget requested to actually dramatically cut housing benefits that help families that are low-income seniors, that have people with disabilities, families with children and veterans. You know, overall, the administration's proposed cut to HUD programs has been by an astonishing $9.6 billion. That would be devastating. And so that's why it's so critically important we have hearings like this and that we have everybody make sure that they're participating and then they're engaged so that we can help fight back against these proposed cuts. Now, we hear proposal after proposal that will be cut back that would only negatively impact all the work that people on this panel are doing, and it will do. Ms. King-Veland, would you maybe like to comment on what would happen, how the problem would get worse if we had this actual cut of the $9.6 billion to HUD programs?
We've talked about the fact that we have more than 10,000 units of permanent supportive housing in the pipeline, and we've talked about how critically important those units are. But without vouchers and rental subsidies, those units don't come on. So it goes beyond sort of discussions of impact fees and other costs related to rising housing costs. If we don't have the vouchers and the rental subsidies to be able to put those people into the units, those projects don't get built.
Thank you. Ms. Laras, you have done fabulous work. I represent the community of Jordan Downs. Can you tell us an update on where we are on that, and when are we going to see people moving into that facility?
Sure, absolutely. And we would welcome you to join us on Move-In Day. We have made a lot of progress with Jordan Downs, with the new Jordan Downs and the new housing there. We will be ready to move our first families into the new units this fall, September, October months, so right around the corner. So I'm a little bit about the game because we intended to provide an invitation to help move in our families. Completing phase 1 and phase 2 of Jordan Downs and moving into other phases, as you are well aware, we are replacing 1-for-1 unit and exceeding that amount. Currently, there's some 104 units at Jordan Downs. The new Jordan Downs will have 1,400 units.
Great. Thank you. I will, I'll yield back my time. I'll leave it for the next
Thank you
round.
very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Jimmy Gomez of the 34th District of California for 5 minutes for questions.
Madam Chair, thank you so much for hosting this important hearing. I got elected to Congress about July of 2017 is when I was sworn in. It was one of the first elections after the presidential, and I represent downtown, everything from Hancock Park, very wealthy neighborhoods, to Skid Row, to Boa Heights, unincorporated City Terrace, to Eagle Rock. And we see a variety of issues. One of these things that I tried to work on since I was a student at UCLA was this issue of housing. And I recognized early on that we had no housing policy in the state of California, that the housing policy was sprawl. Build out as far as the eye can see so that you can reduce the rents and the pressure in the big cities. How do I know that? Because my family, when we were living in Orange County, got forced out. The house that we lived in got bulldozed and turned into a Taco Bell. Imagine that, a Taco Bell. So my parents went out to Riverside, got a house there, bought it, it was relatively affordable. But that pressure valve, that release valve, no longer really exists. Out in Riverside and San Bernardino counties, they're having higher rent increases, percentage-wise, than they hear in the city of LA County. So it doesn't exist. And this is a problem, as everybody knows, that was years in the making. Skid Row didn't come out of nowhere. It was a strategic strategy by the city of LA and the county to push and force people that were homeless into a specific area and provide the resources, right? And so we act like this thing came out of nowhere, you know, but it is something that decision makers over the years had created. Like it or not, everybody's responsible. So what are we going to do now is the question. There's no other state that has this kind of issue. I asked a friend of mine who is the director of housing community development for the governor, previously Governor Brown and now Gavin Newsom. He was at HUD. He said there's no other place, no other state that has this type of problem. So I agree, we have a lot of problems and we have to look at a multinodal approach. I agree with that. But we have to start thinking outside the box. And maybe it is time to break the wheel when it comes to this merry-go-round of homelessness and housing and that keeps going over and over and over. Because it seems that we're losing ground. One of the issues that I want to, we heard some things. Mr. Ansell, you mentioned that the county provides the services and some rental assistance, and that the city, I take it that you meant City of LA, is responsible for capital development. One of the things I want to know is what are the other cities in LA County doing when it comes to providing more units? Because I know that not everybody is carrying their fair share.
Thank you, Congressman. If I could just clarify my prior comment, both the City of Los Angeles and the County of Los Angeles are investing very heavily, both locally generated and state funding for the development of permanent supportive housing. My specific comment previously was with respect to Proposition HHH and other Los Angeles City funding for permanent supportive housing. How is the county collaborating? And in that regard, yes, we are providing the supportive services that go along with those new units. With respect to the other 87 cities in the county, we have seen that cities have a central role to play in this countywide effort and have reached out in an unprecedented way to cities across the county to engage their participation. The county has funded 40 cities in the county to develop city-specific homelessness plans and has allocated a portion of Measure H funding to those cities to support implementation of those homelessness plans. The single biggest focus of those city homelessness plans and of the county funding provided by the cities is to support cities' utilization of their land use authority in a way that will result in the production of additional permanent supportive housing, affordable housing, and other interim housing. That can include, for example, feasibility studies of individual parcels, government-owned parcels, for example, that could be used for housing, or consultant assistance to help small cities modify land use ordinances, for example, relative to motel conversion or permanent supportive housing or accessory dwelling units. So what I would say is that on the one hand, we are engaged with smaller cities throughout the county in an unprecedented way, and that there is an unprecedented level of interest among many cities in responding to this challenge and constructively addressing the homeless crisis, including through the increase in housing. And on the other hand, we have a very long way to go in ensuring that cities throughout the county exercise their land use authority in a way that maximizes the availability of housing.
And the time's up, but that's a good point, because I know for a fact the state of California has given back to a lot of cities former state property, Caltrans property, that was supposed to be used for housing, and they're not using it. And that is a big problem. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Grace Napolitano from the 32nd District of California for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all your hard work and the rest of the committee. Ms. King-Violent, we know that there are a great amount of homeless in Los Angeles County, and that you've recently changed strategy to preventing it. addressing it more holistically, ending generational poverty. But do you work with the cities, and do you work with the agencies, all of them? Everybody's doing their bit, but does anybody get together and talk as a group and say, okay, let's start a program? Because part of it, I'm chair of the Mental Health Caucus in Washington, pardon me, and it is the third largest reason of homelessness, mental health. We must include it in all programs so that it can take care of the problem before it gets worse. The cities sometimes start a preventive program. Norwalk is beginning to look at uniting to find out how can they keep people in homes. If they have a health emergency, an accident, all the things that Kevin talked about, they can pay for 1 or 2 months rent so that family can stay in the homes and not go homeless. But that's an innovative program that needs help, and we should be able to make a difference in keeping people in homes. Also, attractive places for homeless to go to, the riverbeds, near hospitals. But we must also talk to the railroad and Caltrans and others to find out what properties they have in excess that can be used to build homeless, all right, near railroad, noisy, near freeway, pollution maybe, but at least they would have transitional housing. What can we do? What are you doing to do that?
Thank you for the question. I think to your original question, yes, there are a great deal of efforts that are happening from a regional perspective, and Measure H and Triple H has really served at helping build an infrastructure. So we're working in partnership with our partners at the Homeless Initiative at the county. We work with LASA, we work with HACLA and others, and we're implementing programs in a much more systematic and seamless way. And that, I think, has been helpful. So as I mentioned earlier with something like our Homeless Incentive Program, for example.
Is that in LA County alone, or is it
No,
throughout
it's
the county?
countywide. So, I mean, that's sort of the benefit. So there are 18 other housing authorities, for example, that are operating within the Southern California region. And one of the things that is great is that we're working with them. So our Homeless Incentive Program, it looks the same for a client, whether they come in HACLA's door or whether they come in our door, because the idea is the program is seamless. It runs the same at HACLA as it runs for us. So the idea is to create a regional approach to attacking issues. Much of the housing development we're doing, we have a lot of those projects in partnership with the City of LA for the work that we're doing, as well as the City of Pasadena, Glendale, and other cities as well. So we are taking a county-wide approach to addressing the issues and breaking down those silos.
Do you include communications to the cities of what you're doing? Because I know my cities, some of them do, they know, others don't. And I need to know what kind of information is going to the cities to make them aware, because they also have the homeless transitioning to them.
That's great.
Yes, Congresswoman, through the Homeless Initiative, we have very actively engaged cities throughout the region. We've convened 2 homeless summits, the first ever in the history of all the cities, and we have a designated liaison for each of the cities, and we invited all of the cities in the county to develop their own homelessness plans with funding from the county.
Do you work with the COGS, the Council of Governments?
Yes, we do. We work with the Council of Government. In fact, we provide ongoing funding.
Does the money flow to the cities?
We provide funding to the COGS to coordinate the efforts in their cities. And then, as I mentioned, we have approved funding to those cities that developed homelessness plans to support implementation of those plans.
Well, I'd like to know more about those, because I have not heard yet. There is some information coming back to me, but not necessarily with the COGS or with some of the cities. So it's important that we get the ability to understand that they are part of it, that they are, maybe their representative doesn't attend meetings. I don't know, but we need to make sure, because the homeless situation is getting critical, and it's worse in the San Gabriel Valley. Madam, I yield back.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank our first panel of witnesses for their testimony today. We will now pause to set up our second panel for today's hearing. Thank you so very much for coming for your testimony. While we are awaiting our second panel, I'd like you to know that I did ask our elected officials to stand Mayor Robert Pullen Miles represents Lawndale, California.
Yeah, that's right. Unless they start.
Mayor Patrick Fury represents Torrance, California.
And also,
Mr. Jimmy Gao is here, who is a commissioner in Torrance, California, working with homeless issues also. I'm told that we have a number of ministers in the audience, and that many of the ministers are involved with homeless ministries in the church, where they're taking clothing and food and toiletries down to Skid Row every day. Would all of the ministers please stand, and Shane Scott, who is representing Macedonia Church. All the ministers. We also have a number of veterans in the audience. Will all of those who are veterans or representing veterans organizations? I see in the back of the room, we do have a representatives from New Directions. Please stand, Larry, in the back of the room. Raise your hand. Thank you very much. Would the second panel please come forward? Oh, hi, hello, how are you? Good to see you.
It went well.
Yeah, it did.
Really well.
Went very well. Thank you for being here. So kind of you. So kind of you. Okay, all right, we'll recess. See you. Thank you. Oh, good to see you. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, how are you? The committee is in recess for just 1 more minute, and then we're going to reconvene. So if you will begin to take your seats now. Please take your seats. We are going to get started with our second panel. Thank you very much. Would you please take your seats? Please take your seats so we can get started. Please take your seats so that we may get started. Our second panel includes Mr. Tim Watkins, President and Chief Executive Officer, Watts Labor Community Action Committee, Mr. Joe Fourier, Western Region Program Vice President, Local Initiative Support Corporation, Becky Dennison, Executive Director, Venice Community Housing, Anthony Hayes, Speak Up, Advocate Corporation for Supportive Housing, Erica Hartman, Chief Program Officer, Downtown Women's Center, and Chancellor, that is Al Mansour, who is Executive Director of the Housing Rights Center, Alma Vizcano, Speaker, Downtown Women's Center on behalf of Domestic Violence Homeless Services Coalition, and Deborah Adora DeLong Gallo, President and Chief Executive Officer, Community of Friends. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Each of you will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. I will give you a signal by tapping the gavel lightly when 1 minute remains. At that time, I would ask you to wrap up your testimony so that we can be respectful of both the witnesses and the committee members' time. Mr. Watkins, you are recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you, and I won't spend too much time saying what an honor it is to be here, but I really appreciate your work and always have on all fronts. Having been here for 66 years, always being a boy of Watts, born and raised in Watts, I've been blessed to be around the Watts Labor Community Action Committee its entire lifetime, as my father was the founder 54 years ago, and you get to see a lot in 54 years. But as an organization that has consistently, constantly, and without interruption provided service and helped support the underdog in society, I'd say that today maybe I'm here representing the brothers on the ground floor. I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but in Watts, there's a network of people that live under people's houses that have raised foundations. They live there with the cooperation of the homeowner or the renter. They bump around at night. No one gets alarmed, but basically they're allowed to subsist in the basement, or not the basement, but the foundation space of those homes. We've seen over 54 years, we've seen Yorty and Mayor Bradley, Mayor Reardon, Mayor Hahn, Mayor Villaraigosa, and now Mayor Garcetti. I won't bother to talk about the broken promises of the past because, maybe this time we're going to see a promise kept. But so far what we've seen over 54 years is a trail of broken promises. WLCAC was around when across the country mental health institutions were being shut down, and we saw the earliest vestiges of homelessness in Watts when people started showing up with nowhere to go. We started serving homeless populations well before there was a LAHSA, before there was a city or a county response to homelessness in South Central Los Angeles, and we've been serving ever since. I think that it's important to recognize that although we made those powerful steps early on, LAHSA has been at the forefront of providing, I guess you would say, the mainstream of service or the funding, the support, and the services that homeless people need. But it's just not enough. We're all here, maybe even some of you. You know, I remember some recent Congress people that were just a check or two away from homelessness themselves. And I think it's important for you to realize that in this audience, lots of us are just a couple checks away from being homeless. And that perhaps, you know, along with what we do about homelessness, we think about the problem of poor public policy versus poverty and what that really means, because we keep talking about poverty as though that's the problem, when poverty is but a symptom of poor public policy and what drives us into these conditions that are not easy to sustain, yet we find ourselves with less than self-sufficiency, certainly less than self-determining, and we watch the descendants of people that, you know, up until 1865 were able to get what they wanted and still do, and here we are, you know, hundreds of years later, still just trying to find what they call that so-called level playing field. There is no level playing field. The playing field is full of empty gold mines, diamond mines, water holes, oil wells, you name it. We look for scraps on the surface, and every night get disparaged. The people in my community get disparaged and treated as if they're subhuman because they have the nobility to go through our trash. They dig through our trash to find recyclables and then line up as if they should be incarcerated by getting pennies on the dollar for what their work is worth all night. And I think that that's what we have to start looking for. How do we prevent the problem in as many ways as we can that are not the traditional ways? We'll talk, and we'll talk about hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, but it takes too long to get the help that people need. When you think about public policy versus poverty and how this all happened, how much of it is by design? Why does someone have to be homeless for a year before they can qualify for service? Maybe their condition doesn't allow them to survive a year of waiting. You know, how many of our people can stand the product of geopolitical gerrymandering in our community? Watts is a place that, unfortunately, is 15 miles away from its base. It's very difficult to get the kind of representation that we need that is Watts specific. What are the impediments? Certainly, we got persecution, human blight, the problem of transitional housing that was long ago constructed to help homeless people that's been torn down only to be replaced by transitional housing. I know I got to go. We got a lot of resources, and I'd like to talk about that in the follow-up if possible.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Fourier, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you. Chair Waters and members of the committee, my name is Joe Fourier. I'm a program vice president for the Local Initiative Support Corporation. Established in 1979, LISC is a national nonprofit dedicated to helping community residents transform disinvested neighborhoods into healthy and sustainable communities of choice and opportunity. We provide local community development organizations with loans, grants, and equity investments, as well as technical and management assistance. We have a national footprint with local offices in 35 cities and a rural program. We invest approximately $1.4 billion each year in these communities. Our doors opened in LA in 1987. We've developed more than 11,000 units of affordable housing in the region with community partners. Nearly $34 million of investments for affordable housing and community development projects have been made in California's 43rd District alone. I oversee the work of our LA office, but wish to acknowledge Tanua Thrash Intuk, who is the executive director of LISC LA and a native Angelino. Our LA team is deeply embedded in community-based efforts to provide assistance to those experiencing homelessness and are in need of affordable housing. I've seen firsthand the challenges of opportunities that exist providing affordable housing to people experiencing homelessness and how nonprofit organizations and others can improve their lives. I'd like to focus my time on what's needed to address this issue. First, this country has to be committed if we want to end homelessness, and these efforts must be supported through sufficient funding resources. For example, our nation's commitment to reducing chronic and veteran homelessness has resulted in substantial declines. This progress is mainly due to the federal government targeting resources for the work. HUD's Continuum of Care homelessness assistance programs provide the main federal resources and incentivize local COCs to prioritize housing-first approaches. LIST supports full funding for HUD COC's federal assistance programs and was pleased to support Representative Waters' Ending Homelessness Act of 2019. This bill would increase McKinney-Vento homeless assistance grant resources for new permanent supportive housing, authorize additional resources for special purpose housing choice vouchers, increase National Housing Trust Fund funding, authorize funding for outreach to homeless people, and better integrate affordable housing and health care activity. This bill recognizes the resources the federal government has to provide if our country is going to continue to make advances in reducing homelessness. Now, LA LISC has worked since its inception to provide assistance to homeless service and affordable housing providers. We provide grants to build organizational capacity, and one of the most important federal capacity building tools we utilize for this work is HUD Section 4 Capacity Building Program. Section 4 awards help nonprofit and housing community development organizations further their affordable housing goals. One example, People Assisting the Homeless, Path Ventures, used HUD Section 4 support to develop West Carson Villas. This development consists of 110 units, 55 which are reserved for formerly homeless residents. LISC also provides financing for affordable housing development, and we typically use low-income housing tax credit equity. The housing credit is the nation's most important development finance subsidy source for affordable rental housing and works by providing equity for such housing in exchange for federal tax credits. Our subsidiary, the National Equity Fund, NEF, is one of the largest nonprofit syndicators of LIHTC and a national expert in using housing credits to finance supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. LISC uses other federal resources to support this work, including the Capital Magnet Fund. CMF is a competitive affordable housing award administered by the Treasury Department, which can be used flexibly by mission-driven lenders such as LISC and nonprofit developers for affordable rental housing for very poor households. An example of the impact of CMF and the housing credit is our recent support for LA Family Housing's Irma's Family Campus. Once a homeless shelter operating at a former motel, it completed its transformation into a campus that offers health, housing, and other services in San Fernando Valley. The campus includes the Fiesta Apartments, 49 units of permanent supportive housing targeting chronically homeless single adults. LISC NEF invested nearly $13.6 million of housing tax credit equity in a $20.7 million project. And LISC used its CMF award to provide a reduced interest permanent loan to close the financing gap on the apartments. LISC LA's history of supporting affordable housing projects for those experiencing homelessness has shown us that progress can be made when resources are made available to address need. We urge Congress to adequately fund and support federal housing assistance and tax credit programs which provide stable housing for homeless people, and to support programs that build the capacity of nonprofit organizations serving these communities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to working with you and your staff on ways to end the homeless crisis here in LA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we will hear from Ms. Dennison. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. I'm Becky Dennison with Venice Community Housing. We own and operate affordable and supportive housing focused on ensuring inclusive communities on LA's West Side. For over 30 years, we have been providing housing and other support to those most in need. And we are currently building new supportive housing in Venice, which is home to about 1,000 unhoused residents. We are also active in community organizing and advocacy efforts that preserve existing affordable housing and promote the rights of tenants and unhoused residents. We simply, as everyone said, need vastly more resources to produce extremely low income and supportive housing. So affordability matters in production. We can't just produce and expect the results to trickle down. The federal budget for affordable housing was cut almost 80% in the early 80s and has never been restored, and as was noticed, we continue to see cuts chipping away at it. And locally, production is nowhere near the documented need. In the last housing element, the city projected to produce 75% of its overall housing need, but only 17% of the extremely low-income housing need. So with the largest production gaps at the lowest income levels and overproducing luxury housing, homelessness continues at crisis levels in LA. LA has also underproduced supportive housing, creating just a few hundred units per year for 20 years. And the ballot initiatives that people have discussed are incredibly important and will do good work, but are a drop in the bucket in the overall need. We need the city and county and the state to create permanent and sustained resources, and we need the federal government to supplement those resources. Most specifically, we need to increase rental subsidy, as people have said. Right now, we're making decisions in a scarcity environment. We have to balance the need for new supportive housing, affordable housing, public housing, and tenant-based housing choice vouchers within this limited pool of subsidy. And there is just nowhere near enough to cover even a portion of all of those needs. The federal government must also help us address the issue of underproduction of extremely low-income housing. Because while the tax credit program is incredibly important, it just is not designed to produce extremely low-income housing, and then therefore that's where we see our biggest gap. Beyond housing production, we must put more effort into the prevention of homelessness, and the preservation of all affordable, rent-stabilized, and other subsidized rental housing must be prioritized. And while these are largely issues at the local and state level, and our local government and state government must make preservation more of a priority, we also do need targeted federal investment to make this a comprehensive effort. Prevention of homelessness also requires increased tenant protections and proactive enforcement of those protections. Tenants too far regularly face unjust and illegal eviction and other forced displacement. And again, some of these challenges and solutions are focused on state and local issues, and our state government has some important policies pending, but the federal government can help ensure more proactive enforcement of public and subsidized housing tenant protections, rent to prevent eviction programs and funding, and then the prevention of any policy that would produce displacement, such as the proposed mixed status policy that was also discussed. Government entities must also eliminate the unacceptable overrepresentation of Black people experiencing homelessness that has been persistent in LA for far too long. Los Angeles has studied this recently and has a report and recommendations that Mr. Lin discussed that really look at the long history of institutional racism, and further exploration of that from this committee is recommended. And lastly, LA must end the criminalization of homelessness. This is an area where LA has been uniquely horrible in its efforts. We have the largest unsheltered homeless population in the country, and yet without creating any significant housing alternatives, LA has invested incredible financial and political resources in policies explicitly intended to criminalize homelessness and other initiatives that result in harassment and forced displacement of unhoused residents. These practices exacerbate homelessness, lengthen the time people remain homeless, and discriminate against people for their current unhoused status. This simply must end and be replaced with health-based, street-based interventions until LA provides housing for all in need. So in closing, we know that LA and California must enact substantial new policies and funding streams that focus on production at the lowest income levels and homeless prevention, as well as eliminate harmful policies. But LA and all regional efforts cannot succeed without more investment at the federal level. HR 1856 reflects a significant step forward, and additional efforts will be needed to solve this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dennison. Now I would like to ask Mr. Haynes to give his testimony. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to present that testimony.
Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Haynes, and I'm a CSA Speak Up advocate. I grew up in an average middle-class community with 6 siblings and a mother and a father in the home. And my mother and father used to shelter me from what was around the corner. Till one day I found out what was around the corner, and I became an alcoholic. I became a functioning alcoholic. Over the years, my disease got worse, but I was still able to find a job, keep an apartment, until I could no longer work, suffering from mental health issues. Until I found myself 10 years of homelessness. I ended up on Skid Row, and I go to jail for 1 year, exactly 1 year, for possession of marijuana. And when I got out of jail, I knew I needed something different. I knew I wanted to do something different with my life. So with that year clean from alcohol and drugs, I got on a wait list, and it took a long time for me to get permanent supportive housing. But when I finally got in, it made a big difference in my life. Supportive housing is very important. Not only just housing a person, but with the wraparound services, with the case manager on site, the therapist, psychiatrist, right at my disposal. It took me a long time to find my worth. You know, they had so many groups to offer, art group, journal group, till I ended up doing a knitting group. And coming from the streets, I'm like, I'm not finna sit in a circle and share my feelings. So I took a knitting group for exactly 1 year, and in the group, they sat and watched Oprah and knitted. So after 1 year, I never learned to knit. But I sat with a group of women that helped me regain who I am. You know, it gave me so much perspective on life. It showed me a different way that I can go and to grow. So it was so important for me to have them groups. And in saying that is, you know, the housing is important, but more important is the wraparound services that come with it. People that's gonna be there for when you need them. Giving them housing is important, but now that you're housed, you have to learn to live with yourself. And how do I do that? Sober. You know, it was a big challenge. You know, depression sets in. But a long story short, I continue to work on myself. I continue to take advantage of what was offered to me to help provide it within the supportive system. And with that, they watched me grow, and I am now a peer advocate manager for Skid Row Housing Trust. I moved into one of their buildings, and now I get to be an advocate for the future residents and help them understand what it's gonna feel like once you move into your own apartment by yourself. You're gonna feel lonely, and a lot of us resort back to what we used to know, our old friends and the drugs and alcohol. So now I show them a way that you don't have to go back. We're gonna build a new bridge, we're gonna build new friends, and we're gonna go a new way. So now I walk the potential residents, I help them navigate all the resources that's at their disposal within the community. And it is so important that they know that it's out there for them. A lot of stuff is offered to them, but it's half the time it's stuff they don't need or can't use. Everything offered is not for every individual. So I just want to thank you for coming out and listening to what we have to say.
And I want to thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Haynes. Ms. Hartman, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman and members of the committee and California delegation. My name is Erica Hartman, and I am the Chief Program Officer of the Downtown Women's Center. For over 40 years, the Downtown Women's Center has been providing housing and vital services to women in the Skid Row area of Los Angeles, and today serves over 4,000 women per year. In recent years, we've seen homelessness in Los Angeles rise to unprecedented levels, and in the last year, the number of women grew to 18,337 individual women. Homelessness among women is increasing nationally as well, and on any given night, 216,211 women are experiencing homelessness in this country. Women comprise 39% of the individuals experiencing homelessness, and 49% of those are unaccompanied women. The Downtown Women's Center exists because we recognize that women are a unique subpopulation experiencing homelessness who have corresponding unique needs. For this reason, we continue to advocate for HUD to officially recognize women as a unique subpopulation, specifically unaccompanied women. As an example of the unique vulnerabilities faced by unaccompanied women, they are 4 times more likely to be chronically homeless, and for this reason need resources to serve them. The areas of focus should be on increasing data and research, targeting services and housing toward women, and requiring that gender competency and program evaluation be criterion to receive funding for housing and service provision. At the Downtown Women's Center, we serve anyone who identifies as female or was identified female at birth. Women experiencing homelessness on Skid Row identify as LGBTQ at a rate of 15.4%, compared with 3.4% of the general population. For this reason, we are strong advocates for maintaining the equal access rule without changes, but would otherwise support H.R. 3018. 90% of women residing in Skid Row have experienced some form of violence during their lifetime, and for this reason, we are advocating for H.R. 6545. And for the release of additional dollars from the Victims of Crime Act Fund. As we know, women in the military experience high rates of sexual harassment and assault, making them vulnerable to other than honorable discharges and thereby ineligible to receive HUD-VASH vouchers. For this reason, we ask for support in advancing H.R. 2398. Even with the level of risk that we know women face on the streets, 64% of women experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles County are unsheltered, and unsheltered women remain without stable housing for an average of 14 to 16 years. And because of insufficient shelter in Los Angeles, just 1 in every 12 is able to access a shelter bed on any given night. Women who are unsheltered age close to 20 years faster, and between 2014 and 2018 in Los Angeles, the number of deaths among homeless women more than doubled. While the life expectancy for women is typically longer than for men, for homeless women it is shorter. The average age of death for women experiencing homelessness is 48. For this reason, it is crucial that H.R. 1978 receives the necessary support, and we also hope to see more House members co-sponsor H.R. 3272. In Los Angeles, economic hardship is the cause of 53% of homelessness. We have seen rents increase by 32% while income has gone down by 3%. Income inequity bears especially hard on women who continue to make only 79 cents for each dollar earned by men, and women of color are the most significantly impacted. There is also vast disproportionality by race of individuals experiencing homelessness due to systemic racism. The racial inequities of the justice system have caused African American women to be the most significantly impacted by histories of incarceration when seeking employment, with an unemployment rate of 43.6%, almost 10% higher than any other demographic. Women also comprise a significant portion of single-parent households, and in the event that HUD moves forward with the proposed change to the mixed status rule, we support H.R. 2763. Homelessness is a matter of resources, and for that reason, ongoing support of H.R. 3163 is essential to ending homelessness. And most importantly, the investment of H.R. 1856 would significantly increase the likelihood that organizations will have the opportunity to get ahead of the curve in meeting the needs, ensure focus is maintained on ending the homeless crisis, protect our progress, and help us gain more ground through mandatory spending. Thank you, Congresswoman Waters, for introducing this legislation, and the committee for your support of this bill.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hartman. Ms. Al-Mansour, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you other respected members of Congress for allowing us this opportunity to speak with you today. I'm Chancellor Al-Mansour, the Executive Director of the Housing Rights Center. I'm also on the board of the National Fair Housing Alliance and the California Reinvestment Coalition as well. In 1993, I was here, and a similar hearing was held in Los Angeles. The Federal Reserve Bank and members of Congress came here to determine what were the reasons for the civil unrest, what was the reason for the lack of income and housing and so forth in South Los Angeles. And we talked about poverty, we talked about racism, lack of access to credit, no banks. We talked about no grocery stores, no jobs. And the one thing we didn't really highlight was homelessness. Here we are 26 years later, and the main issue we're facing right now is homelessness, caused by all of those things. As you've heard, the U.S. government's history of financing and promoting redlining, which was the denial of home ownership and home mortgage loans and home improvement loans to Black and other racially targeted groups, created racially segregated and highly racially concentrated neighborhoods with no services. This created the urban blight that depreciated the value of Black-owned homes that today have made those neighborhoods ripe for gentrification and displacement. Everybody complains about LA's traffic, but with new access to public transportation and revitalization measures, Boyle Heights, Highland Park, Crenshaw District, Chinatown, other parts of South Los Angeles are all experiencing extreme displacement of Black and brown and low-income Asian communities. And for those fortunate groups who were able to purchase their homes and own their own homes, those abuelas, the grandmothers, the big mamas, they have lost their homes. When they pass away, their home is often sold. It's too valuable for the family to hold on to. Those families, those houses transition, and those families will never be able to come back into Los Angeles. Also, just the attack on Black-owned homes in general, the lack of access to credit and the targeting through predatory home mortgage loans and so forth has created the circumstance in which we see now, in which Black homeownership has just been devastated in Los Angeles. And when you talk about Big Mama's home was the refuge, right? It was the place where people who had been evicted, maybe they were formerly incarcerated, maybe they otherwise lacked housing. Those children, those grandchildren could go to Big Mama's house to live. But now that she does not have those homes, so many of our community members don't have that place of refuge to go to. And also the Housing Rights Center, I want to identify that the prevalence of housing discrimination and the devastating effects of housing discrimination are also causes of our homelessness crisis. While race discrimination is highly reported, not necessarily by tenants, but we find it in our investigations at the Housing Rights Center, because oftentimes people don't know that they've been discriminated against based on race. And so investigations and testing is strongly needed. And I thank Congressman Al Green for his March 2018 letter supporting the Fair Housing Act, supporting Fair Housing Initiatives funding, and all of you members of Congress who signed that letter, I thank you as well, and I encourage for those of you who didn't sign it to sign it as well. The FIP program must be fully funded, and we're asking for at least $52 million of funding, which isn't that much considering it goes to 100 organizations over the country to combat housing discrimination. Testing and other programs is the only way we can really determine oftentimes if race discrimination happens. Persons with disabilities also face high rates of discrimination in housing. More than 50% of the complaints that are filed with the Housing Rights Center are based on discrimination based on disability. The Fair Housing Act also must be preserved as well. And disparate impact. Disparate impact is being challenged. It's being targeted by this current administration. The use of the disparate impact theory to prove unlawful discrimination must be protected. HUD has initiated its plan to weaken the Fair Housing Act by making it impossible to bring a case using the use of the disparate impact theory, which maintains that a facially neutral policy, when applied, can have a disparate impact upon a particular group because of their membership. Banks and insurance groups are leading the charge to dismantle this important fair housing protection. So we ask that in all ways the use of the disparate impact theory be protected. Also, the HUD's equal access rule must be reinstated as well. Moreover, families with minor children, Latinos, African Americans, and women are disproportionately impacted by these facially neutral policies and face eviction every day in the city of Los Angeles, and we ask for their protection as well. I also ask that we preserve the Community Reinvestment Act. A way that this committee and other federal agencies and departments can address the homelessness crisis is to strengthen the Community Investment Act. It did well for California as well. A recent survey by the California Reinvestment Coalition found that over $27 billion in 2016 came to low-income communities in California because of the Community Reinvestment Act. HUD approved a conciliation agreement just a couple weeks ago that settled a Los Angeles area redlining case against One West Bank and CIT Corporation. That was a case filed by the California Reinvestment Coalition for HUD because of One West Bank and CIT's redlining policies here in Los Angeles. They had over 60 retail bank branches in Los Angeles, in Southern California. Not one of those was located in a community of color. The CRA exam also must be strengthened and must consider fair lending law violations. Until recently, all the bank regulators considered unlawful discrimination in lending as a factor when denying CRA exams, and they don't anymore. Finally, a right to counsel. We must have a right to counsel to protect tenants who are being
Thank you
evicted.
very much, Ms. Al-Mansour. Ms. Vizcaino, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, good morning. My name is Alma Vizcaino, and I thank you so much for taking listening to my experience, I'm here today to bring some light, some statistics. You will hear about the impact on homeless women. What is troubling me is that I was one of 216,000 women experiencing homelessness across the nation. In Los Angeles, among both sheltered and unsheltered, approximately half experienced domestic violence. Of course, please keep in mind this is a count of women that felt comfortable sharing that they had experienced domestic violence. Due to the stigma surrounding domestic violence, we know that this is an undercounted experience. This was the case for me. I did not acknowledge that I had experienced domestic violence until just 2 years ago when I was sitting in a mental health support group at the Downtown Women's Center, a local nonprofit that supports women with housing and health care. I swept it under the rug for a long time. There was never a good time to talk about it, so I didn't. Consequently, I have experienced periods of homelessness, mental health problems related to the impact of trauma, and chronic health conditions like diabetes as a result of my hardships. I was born in Tijuana, raised as a toddler in South Central. At an early age, I started running away from a home of alcoholism and depression. That impacted my ability to stay housed. My life was filled with struggle. The depression ended in having many unhealthy relationships. Domestic violence blanked me out mentally. Many women are ashamed and do not admit to control and abuse that they suffer. And some find it hard to get help that they need. When I first reached out for help at a shelter in the 80s with my 2 kids, it didn't really work. All of the shelter staff were white. There were no Hispanics or blacks. And that was really weird for me because I grew up in South Central. We ended up leaving the shelter because it was just awkward. I did ultimately find help that I needed through a domestic violence shelter called the House of Ruth. After our stay there, my kids and I left to housing through Section 8 they gave us, and we lived for 20 years with the Section 8. I also became a board member with the House of Ruth and found fulfillment in giving back in that way. For many years, we lived in the Los Feliz community. We felt safe, and my family thrived. My kids were doing well in school, and I carried a few jobs. We were comfortable, and we did not have to move around or fear facing evictions. But then my building was sold, and I couldn't find another rental owners to rent to me with my voucher. So I ended up back in South Central, and it was very different, just in the same city, but South Central and Los Feliz was such like day and night. And but I put my kids in private school through scholarships, but we couldn't escape the violence, the gang-related violence also in the neighborhood. And we were evicted because of a shooting, and my children and I just had to go, everyone had to go wherever they could. We didn't have a plan, we didn't have nothing. So I now live in a single-room occupancy in Skid Row community, and I love Skid Row. It looks very bad and it stinks, but there's so much good also going on in it, and I really love it. When I got the room, I thought now I can apply myself to do my goals and all that, and I ended up very more depressed than when I was homeless. It was so hard to adjust to now I'm in a room and now I have a place, but my mind, it wasn't able to focus, properly. Anyways, let's see. I needed more support to heal from my trauma, and that I'm in the process right now of that. The supports that that most effectively helped me were the shelters. I love the shelters, the ministries, and individuals that came through Skid Row just to be nice and good to the people. That really touched my heart, and that really helped. I'm now at a job with the Downtown Women's Center, a training called LA Rise, where I am a support staff at a social enterprise. And I look forward to graduating the program. Congress should take many steps to end homelessness and prevent violence against women, including ensure that the HUD budget...
Thank you, Ms. Vizcano. Ms. Gallo, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair and members of the committee and the LA congressional representatives here today, I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony to the Financial Services Committee. My name is Dora Gallo, and I'm the president and CEO of a Community of Friends. We're a nonprofit, community-based development corporation with a very specific focus of ending homelessness for people with mental illness. Began 30 years ago, our organization has been developing what's now called permanent supportive housing long before this particular term was created. By combining affordable housing with services for the most vulnerable in our community, we have ended homelessness for thousands. In the 30 years that we've been around, we've created 50 apartment buildings throughout Los Angeles and Orange County, including 2 in San Diego. We have 1 building in Representative Waters' district. We have 3 in Representative Berrigan's district, 1 in Representative Napolitano district, and 12 in Representative Gomez's district. Currently, we house 2,500 adults, including over 600 children. People who have a chronic disability, such as mental health or addiction, have always been particularly vulnerable to losing their housing. They have limited financial resources, less family support, and they need extensive help and services to exit homelessness. These are the people whom we serve. As some of you have noted, the recent explosion of homelessness in LA County is not caused by an increase of the number of people with chronic disabilities. Many people are falling into homelessness due to the extreme lack of affordable housing in Los Angeles, and the longer they stay homeless, the more likely they are to develop mental health issues. Stagnant wages, rising rents, and decades of disinvestment in affordable housing have enabled a heated real estate market to cause havoc on our limited housing supply. Rents are rising faster than renter incomes. The median monthly asking rent in Los Angeles is now $2,471. So that means renters in LA need to earn $47 per hour to afford the median rent. 79% of extremely low-income households in LA are paying more than half of their income for housing. The supply of affordable rental housing is also not keeping pace with demand. Recent studies show that LA needs over 516,000 more affordable rental units to meet the demand. In 2018, the city of Los Angeles permitted 27,000 homes, but only 2,900 of them were affordable, 11%. And according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, there are only 18 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 extremely low-income renter households in this metropolitan area. So housing for the lowest income must be available if we are to end homelessness. And for those with chronic disabling conditions, supportive housing combined with a harm reduction approach is the most effective tool to keep people with disabilities from cycling back into homelessness. No matter where in the community our buildings are located, from San Fernando Valley to San Pedro, Boyle Heights to Hollywood, Compton to Koreatown, we have found that given an opportunity to live in decent, safe, and affordable housing, people can begin focusing on those other issues that led to their homelessness. Providing the level of support and services needed to end homelessness for people who've been on the streets for years requires sustained and long-term commitment. Investments in federal programs must continue if homelessness is truly to be eradicated. So we agree with Chairwoman Waters that it's difficult to make significant progress towards ending homelessness in LA without substantial new funding. The citizens of LA have done our part by voting to tax ourselves to provide the resources needed. We need Congress to take action as well. We commend Chairwoman Waters for introducing H.R. 1856, the Ending Homelessness Act of 2019. The $13 billion proposed will be amongst the most significant investment towards this crisis. In addition to homeless programs, Congress should continue increasing capital investments to build, preserve, and rehab homes affordable to people with the lowest income, such as housing finance reform related to GSEs. That's an opportunity to increase resources to the National Housing Trust Fund. We also support efforts to expand and improve the low-income housing tax credit. In LA, it is used to create supportive housing, so we urge Congress to support H.R. 3077, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, that would expand the Housing Credit Authority by 50%. And we urge Congress to continue project-basing rental subsidies to ensure housing affordability, including project-basing HUD-VASH vouchers. And I want to conclude my remarks by saying that despite the challenges and the scale of the problem, there is hope. LA has a strong community of nonprofit organizations, public officials, business leaders, and private citizens with the passion, skill, and commitment to end homelessness. Partnering with our congressional leaders, we know we can do this. We don't have a choice. Thank you, Chairwoman, for holding this hearing and for soliciting our input.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gallo. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions, but before I do, I would like to give special recognition to Ms. Jasmine Borrego, who is the president of Telecu Resident and Management and Property Management, and thank Telecu for all of the work it's doing for developing low-income housing. Thank you very much. And I did mention the veterans, but Ms. Akila Templeton, who is the Executive Director of U.S. Vets in my district, doing a fabulous job. Thank you very much for being here. I see the yellow T-shirts are here today. That's ACE, Alliance of California for Community Empowerment, is here. Thank you very much, ACE. And Susan Burton, A New Way of Life, that is transitioning women from incarceration into our communities. Thank you so very, very much. Thank all of you. Mr. Watkins, of course, I know WLCAC very well. My career has been developed along with the long-time services that have been presented by WLCAC, and I thank you for your leadership. I worked with your father, and so I know the origins of WLCAC and all that you have contributed. And I'm very pleased to hear about even another housing complex that you have developed, the Delois McCoy Villa. I have cut ribbons for you and that organization more than once, and I congratulate you one more time on a project providing housing opportunities for those who certainly would not get them but for WLCAC or an organization like yours. You mentioned it is something sometimes with public policy that creates homelessness and a lack of opportunity, and I agree with you on that. And I want to ask you if, in fact, being located right adjacent to and surrounded by Nickerson Gardens, Jordan Downs, Imperial Courts, and a number of the public housing projects, Gonzac Village is also there. Have you witnessed those who have been evicted from public housing because of a failed policy that we have in federal government that evicts families sometimes because one member of the family may have gotten into a problem of some kind, trying to return back maybe from incarceration, et cetera? Are you familiar with that policy?
Well, absolutely. And to my chagrin, sometimes families in multiple are evicted summarily, and there isn't any clear explanation. There's an article in either Popular Science or Popular Mechanics, I believe it's Popular Science, where some of their writers went along with LAPD one night to witness the effectiveness of shock and awe tactics. And they used explosive devices and bright light to wake families in the middle of the night, and summarily evicted 44 families one night in Nickerson Gardens. Despite my efforts, the only source of news on that subject that I was able to find was in that article. And, that's one example. I hear too many stories about people being evicted because their child visited them without a permit to park overnight, or that the child got into trouble. But here's the thing. If you're living in the lowest, most affordable, because for me, affordable housing, if you're a billionaire, affordable housing means something different than if you are of the lowest income group. And so the lowest, most affordable housing is what I consider public housing to be. And when you get evicted from that, I know there is nowhere to go. You'll recall that I've talked to you a number of times about who makes up the population downtown. It would be very interesting to find out how the population downtown is made up of people that have been evicted from the most affordable low-income housing.
And what about an attempt to keep people from sleeping in their cars who had no place else to sleep and taking people's possessions on the street? Are you familiar with those policies and what it does to those who have no place else to go and no place to keep their possessions?
Well, so I get criticized because I allow small groups of homeless to live on public property that we own. I get criticized internally and externally because my risk manager says that this is a liability-prone, policy for WLCAC to allow this. I allow people to come in and freely use showers. We have showers that are available to the general public, and they come in at all hours of the night, so we don't lock our compound in overnight. But I do get criticized for it because, after all, it isn't legal to allow people to live on a vacant lot. Meanwhile, I'm trying to break ground on a 46-unit compound just in Compton on 126th and Compton Avenue, Compton Boulevard, and we've been waiting for months to get out of the planning process. We get promised week over week over. I just got a message in here today that we're getting told it'll be another week before we get the sign off on the plans, yet we've been in there since March, and this happens all the time. The process, although I grant that it's necessary, it's far from streamlined. It's anything but streamlined.
I want to thank you very much, and I want you to know that I had a town hall meeting recently where I advised the county that you are feeding people the hot lunch program, our seniors, and they're wandering in from all over and sleeping on the ground all over the city, but they're wandering in to be fed. And so I am coming out with some representatives from the county so that we can get these seniors off the street who you're feeding in addition to all the other stuff that you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes Representative Brad Sherman, again from the 30th District of California.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you for holding these hearings in my district and throughout Los Angeles. Homelessness is the #1 problem I hear about. The federal government has to do more as far as resources. We have to be more efficient in how we spend them. But these hearings will also hopefully shine a light on local policies that cause rents to be so much higher in Los Angeles than they are in so many cities around the country. The rents are too damn high, but also the wages are too damn low. We're told that there's a low unemployment rate, but I won't be satisfied until I have a bunch of guys, and it's always guys, in $1,000 suits blockading my office and using tactics that some groups in here may occasionally use to say, oh my God, we can't find enough workers. And my response will be, have you tried raising the wages? And wages have barely kept up with inflation, and they've never kept up with the inflation and the cost of housing in metropolitan areas. One issue that comes up, and this could be controversial, is how large should a unit be? In Europe and in Japan, each person, even middle class and wealthy people, have smaller units per the number of people living there. If it was our option and our choice, we would want to provide every homeless person, every housing endangered person with a traditional American mini mansion, or as many square foot as we could. But I'll ask first Ms. Gallo, but maybe Mr. Watkins or others would comment. Are we being prevented from building units? The Japanese have been forerunners in how to make people comfortable in less square footage. Is that even legal?
Excuse me, it is actually legal. The building codes actually are quite lenient as it relates to size of a particular apartment that is eligible to be occupied. So I will tell you that the building codes require 70 square feet per person and 120 feet, 120 square feet for one person and an additional 70 for every person. So it can be small.
Can be done.
And that's one reason you've seen some cities promoting micro units, what we call studios, 300 square feet, 325 square feet. What I would caution, though, is to make sure that whatever size unit that we're proposing, that is appropriate for the people living in there for long-term sustainability. If it's too small, someone gets stable in housing over time, they will start to accumulate things and they'll become dissatisfied with the size of their apartment. So it does require thought, but it can be done.
Has anyone else had difficulties being able to site a unit? I know there are neighborhoods in this country where if you try to put more than 4 houses on an acre, the NIMBYs rise up. Mr. Watkins.
Well, certainly planning and housing policy demands that, and you all know about this, ADA compliance. ADA compliance oftentimes makes a project near impossible to plan and complete. But more often than not, it's all of the provisions for square footage within a certain footprint of land. And we've been trying to put forth a project to build 1,000 single occupancy units. We're not sure how far we're going to get, but we think that that would be a good response to people coming out of homelessness by way of incarceration. So we're planning that as we speak.
Well,
I don't know if I answered your question. Those are going to be small units, single occupancy.
Let me see, how much more time do I have? I have 40 seconds, so I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes gentle lady from California, Ms. Barragan.
Thank you. First, I want to start by thanking Ms. Gallo for your work in my district. I know you have 4 sites there. Thank you very much for that work. Mr. Watkins, since the first day that I was a member of Congress, I reached out and we had an opportunity to talk, and I've learned a lot about the work that you're doing in Watts and in the greater community. I want to thank you for that work. We've actually done a number of events at the Watts Labor Community Action Committee where you have your location. I want to talk a little bit about seniors that are experiencing homelessness. You know, the rising housing costs compounded by insufficient retirement income and life's calamities are driving more seniors into Los Angeles streets. In LA County alone, senior homelessness spiked 22% in 2018. Nationally, only 1 of every 3 seniors is eligible for housing assistance because housing programs receive inadequate funding to meet existing growing need. Can you talk a little bit about what unique needs do older adults have from your experience, and how well it is that the homeless services system set up to help them, can help set them so they can get out of homeless quickly? And maybe share some feedback for us on what Congress can be doing to help the situation to better serve this population.
Well, so we are one of the largest senior service providers in the county, in the city, and we have, I don't just say this to blow smoke, we have the best crew, the best staff, the best leadership for that work. And my director, Phyllis Willis, is an absolute expert that's putting input, policy input, to the city and the county of Los Angeles on how we should deal with not only the problem of senior homelessness, but seniors that can't get into our places because they're raising children. Oftentimes they have second and third generation children that they're responsible for and can't get out to get the services that we provide. So we'll go to them, but I think the single largest impediment to seniors availing themselves to the services that are available is information that makes them aware of what the possibilities are. Where do they go? What do they ask for? What can they ask for? And that number is so much larger than the number that we actually serve that I have to think that that's at least the underbelly of part of that beast.
Right. The other thing I want to touch quickly on, I know that you're doing a lot of work on this. Can you share some of what you're doing in the community to make sure the homeless population will be counted in the census? Because we know that could have a disastrous impact on funding for services and programs. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in the community that maybe we can all hear about and learn about?
Well, certainly, as I said, we're building low-income affordable housing. When I say low-income, I mean very low income. We've been very low-income affordable housing providers for 54 years with nearly 1,000 units within 5 minutes of our headquarters in Watts. I said we want to build 1,000 single occupancy units, but we've got hundreds more that now need to be rebuilt, that need to be rehabbed. And the problem with doing that, again, is the bureaucratic process and what it costs to make a project work. But as far as what we're doing to address the problem, I know this afternoon I have a meeting with a gentleman that specializes in container housing. Right. And when we thought about doing container housing 15 years ago, we were told that it would never make it past City Council because it appears as though it's warehousing human beings. We think that container housing is a solution that gentleman congressman spoke about when he talked about small spaces. Container housing can be affordable. It can be completely comfortable with built-in furnishings. It can be made available to people, in large numbers without needing to build it into the ground.
Great. Do you want to comment on the census, to making sure everybody counts and the homeless population counting for the census?
Yes, so every year we participate in that, and our site is a hub where literally, 80, 90 people go out into the community and count. And they have to be, very adept at getting into under the freeway overpasses, down into the canals, and like I mentioned earlier, who's living under someone's home. It's a difficult proposition, but it's also made more difficult with the current administrative policy of targeting people that have, questionable documentation. And that hurts us, that hurts Watts tremendously. For a community that's 75% Hispanic, Latino, we can't even fathom what's going to happen when people that just refuse to be counted are left out of the congressional distribution of resources.
Thank you for your work, and I yield back.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the mayor of the city of Los Angeles has arrived. We're going to continue with our last two questioners, our members of Congress, and then some of the discussion that's been going on about what is happening in the city, I think will be addressed in the mayor's testimony. So, Mr. Mayor, we just have two more members who will be asking questions, and then you're on. Thank you very much. And now the gentleman from Texas, the gentleman, rather, from Texas, Mr. Green, will question for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am, to a certain extent, grateful that I was born into poverty. And I say this because for a good deal of my life, I saw life from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. And when you see life from the bottom up, you learn what the true meaning of "but for the grace of God, there go I. I arrived early enough to visit what's known as Skid Row. I find that name distasteful, by the way. But I visited Skid Row, and I will tell you that people who talk about this problem based upon what we have read cannot truly appreciate the human tragedy unless you see what's happening on what we call Skid Row. It was my misfortune and the misfortune of at least one person for me to be there today, because I literally passed a person who had died on the street. I'm told that this is not an unusual occurrence in that it doesn't happen all the time, but it happens too often. I saw people who were homeless, but also you could sense the hopelessness. You could sense the sense of society has abandoned me. It really is a human tragedy of the highest magnitude. And I appreciate what all of you are trying to do to resolve and help us. I appreciate what the city's trying to do. I appreciate the county. But in the final analysis, we have to get more people involved who understand, but for the grace of God, there go I. Unfortunately, Mr. Watkins, we have a person at the highest office in this land who, in my opinion, does not appreciate, but for the grace of God, there go I. I think that if I could have a wish that would not cause me to find my way to the gates of hell, it would be that the president could live one day on Skid Row. I think he would have a different appreciation for the human tragedy that he, as commander-in-chief, should have a greater sense of responsibility for aiding and assisting and resolving. So I thank you. I wanted to let you know that I appreciate you, all of you, for what you're doing. Now, Ms. Al-Mansour, you mentioned testing. Explain again, you explained it to a limited extent, how important this is in dealing with invidious discrimination, because it is much more pervasive than a good many people would think. Because if you live your life from the top down, you don't see all of the suffering that we who have seen it from the bottom up can appreciate. Would you kindly explain testing again?
Yeah, so testing is basically an undercover measure that fair housing organizations use to determine if there's evidence to show that there was any discrimination in applying for a rental unit or applying for a home or a home loan. In Los Angeles, we do primarily rental testing at the Housing Rights Center. For somebody who's disabled or elderly, maybe have children, oftentimes they know they've been discriminated against when they apply for an apartment or they're being evicted because they've asked for reasonable accommodation, it's been denied. They ask for a caregiver or a support animal or a change in rules. Maybe they get their Social Security benefits on the 3rd, but the rent's due on the 1st, so they keep getting late fees, which is setting them up for eviction. So it's very obvious, that discrimination. It's very obvious when a family is told your children can't play outside, you're going to be evicted if your children come outside and make too much noise. Again, that's an obvious form of discrimination. Race discrimination is not so obvious. Today, most landlords don't say, I don't want you because you're Black, Latino, something else. And oftentimes the tenant who's applying or an applicant doesn't know that they've been discriminated against. So we send similarly situated people in different categories. It could be race, sexual orientation, a lot of different categories, to go apply for that apartment and let us know. how much were you told the rent would be? Were you given an incentive? Were you told you had to move out early and so forth? It is very prevalent, and it happens every day, and unfortunately, most people never know they've been discriminated against.
Thank you. I will yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, I'm so appreciative of your efforts to have this hearing and to bring such a great panel together that are the direct providers on the ground. And while I regret that I won't be able to spend the afternoon with some of you to see some of your programs, please know that I truly appreciate all the work that you're doing. And when I listen to my colleague from Houston talk about growing up from the bottom up, it kind of reminded me of some of my own story. And, you know, people have often asked me, you know, how did it feel growing up poor? And I just simply tell them, it felt great. I didn't know any better. But I'm glad that you all are there working with people to make sure that you can give them some inspiration, work with them, so that they can each feel their comfort zone and feel their comfort level of what space they need in terms of housing, because obviously we know that some folks don't want to be pushed into a house, don't want to be pushed out of underneath that house. There's a certain level of making sure that we know what the individual needs and wants. So for those of you that, Mr. Haynes, first of all, thank you for sharing your story. So when you look at this issue, what is your best advice to someone about transitioning? And, you know, how do you approach them? I mean, what can we learn from you who's transitioned in terms of helping others to transition, if they choose to?
The most important thing is to really listen to what they're saying. We might ask them a question, but we're not going to really listen to the answer. We're just going to tell them, this is what we have, and expect them to make do with what's being offered when it's really not what they need.
And we need to let them make their own choices.
Yes.
Well, thank you for that. And Ms. Viscano, you mentioned the domestic violence and the situations of women, and you also mentioned, I think, some about veterans. And I know from some of my work in Texas, serving on the Veterans Committee in the State Senate, that there are more minority women, black and brown, that are going into the service than ever before. So what specific needs or challenges do we have for that population that we need to try to be mindful of as we consider the funding challenges, not only locally, but federally?
That's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer is to that. Just have more hearings and meetings and let it be brought to the table, the specific needs of the women. Because it's not like a generalized thing. It's, you know, each one is individual, personalized case, and so it's hard to just like assembly line everyone, you know, whether it be women, men, or veterans. I don't know.
Ms. Gallo, do you have any suggestions there? And then I was wondering too about, it seems like over the years, because as I said earlier, I started as a social worker, and I was a legal aid lawyer, so I've dealt with a lot of poverty issues throughout my career. And it seems like there's more women and children in the homeless population, at least that I've seen in Houston. And from the data shows that there's an increase. It used to just be an individual male. Right. Now we're seeing more women and children. So is there any, again, like similar question as I asked Ms. Viscano, is there any specific, you know, different issues that we need to address specific to that population?
Yes, I think Ms. Hartman also had made some references to this in terms of the specialized needs of women, both women unaccompanied as well as women in the military service. I think frequently when we talk about individuals and families, we are doing exactly that and not focusing on the particular needs of women. I think you are right in noticing an increase. We started serving families or even women in the early 2000s. When we first started 30 years ago, we were focusing on individuals and mostly males, and then we started noticing women out on the streets more often. And one of the things that we noticed immediately is the level of trauma that they are encountering. And the reasons that led to their homelessness, in many cases, it was related to domestic violence or intimate partner relationships. And as Ms. Cristina said, that the hesitancy of talking about it. So it takes a long time to figure out what the issue is. You know, you understand the homeless status, but that building that trust and providing that level of services and the mental health support for an individual, for a female, to talk about what led to their homelessness, that's an additional level of support that we don't quite push and focus on in the beginning of the services program, but I think we're starting to do that with some of the recognition and noticing the increases that have come out for the women who are homeless. But trauma is a big part of it, and in recognizing the safety issues related to their discussion of their past histories with domestic violence and intimate partner relationships.
Thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our second panel of witnesses for their testimony here today. And I'd like to say a very special thanks to Ms. Vizcano and Mr. Haynes for coming here and telling your story. And to our panel of witnesses here today, it is your work that causes Mr. Haynes and Ms. Vizcano to be here today to talk about how their lives have been changed. So everybody give a big round of applause to our second panel of witnesses. We will now pause for a minute to set up our third panel for today's hearing. And Mr. Mayor, it's all yours. I'd like to welcome our final witness for today's hearing, the Honorable Eric Garcetti. As you know, Mayor Garcetti is the 42nd mayor of Los Angeles and has served as mayor since 2013. Mr. Mayor, we welcome you, and I thank you for the opportunity that you afforded to me and other members of Congress to visit with you recently while you help us understand exactly what you are doing and what other assistance could be helpful in what you're attempting to do. So with that, Mr. Mayor, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Great. Thank you so much, Chairwoman, and thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your presence here. It's not the first time we've testified together in Exposition Park, but whenever Maxine Waters is in Exposition Park on an important subject, I am there. And this is the most important of all the subjects I've ever come before you to talk about, and I'm so grateful to be for you, to have two Tejanos here. Thank you to Representative Green and Representative Garcia for your lived experience and your perspective, and my dear friend Brad Sherman, who represents my hometown of the San Fernando Valley. Thank you, too, for being a part of this. I come before you today as a mayor, as a parent, as a foster parent, as a volunteer and organizer and a longtime activist on the issue of homelessness. I started, Representative Green, when you're talking about Skid Row, I started when I was 14 on Skid Row, something that predated even my birth by decades, as a place where we deposited our social ills and trauma. And I sometimes think about what the 14-year-old Eric Garcetti would tell the 48-year-old Eric Garcetti if he could talk to him, about how far we've come and how far we have not come. I am asked all the time what causes homelessness, and I'm sure you've had great testimony. I'm the last panel, I guess, panel of one. You're probably a little bit tired, probably a little bit hungry, and probably a little bit depressed hearing some of the things that you've heard today. But I hope to give you a perspective to kind of give you some hope and some belief that this is a human-caused problem that ultimately can be a human-solved problem as well. There's no issue I work on more than this, and mayors across the country I have brought together on this issue. Mayors, ironically, have few of the direct power over the causes in and the cures out of homelessness. We have police forces, we have sanitation departments or bureaus, but you can't clean or arrest your way out of homelessness. When it comes to building housing, preventing evictions, when we come to the most simple way to explain where homelessness comes from, I say it's unaffordable housing meets trauma. That trauma may be the manifestation of veterans coming home from war and the horrors of war. Women, 91% of whom on Skid Row are the survivors of sexual and/or domestic violence. Children who emancipate out of a foster care system. Mental health that's gone untreated. Substance abuse issues. Low wages. These things are different in each person, but some combination lock of all of those pieces of trauma are shared by everybody. It might be just economic trauma for some. The good news here in Los Angeles is we don't come to this conversation saying, wow, we've got a crisis, please figure it out for us. We come, as I heard today, from a place that at the recent national conference for the Coalition to End Homelessness brought together, saying LA is now seen as the model. And I have this conversation with people a lot. Well, I guess the plan isn't working because homelessness in the county went up 12%, or in the city 16%, in a state where the counties on average went up 35% this last year alone. One of the things I point out, though, is that this isn't about whether a model is working now. It's about whether we have the resources to actually fuel that model to success. In military terms, I served in the Navy for 12 and a half years. You can have the best trained people and equipment, but if you don't have scale, you will be defeated eventually, even by folks who have less than you do. And it's an interesting thing to stay with that metaphor. Today, people demand, and rightfully so, and impatiently so, when they see the horrors on the streets of America in our worst places where we're homeless. You see folks who want us to have D-Day, a conquering of Europe, and the Marshall Plan all overnight. So one of my first points would be we have to extinguish the belief that, get rid of that fantasy that there is some magic formula that within a few weeks or months, this will disappear. That we can ship people off to this place over in the desert or on the beach or create a massive tent and just move them away. That's not how this gets done. But on the other extreme, I want you to hear that it's time to get rid of the cynical hopelessness that we can't solve this problem. And I'll give you a couple cases of how I have that faith in my bones. In just 4 years of addressing this problem here in Los Angeles, we've doubled the success that we have in the number of people that we house. And statistics are tough because they can cut both ways, but statistics really are stories. Numbers are really narratives of real people. And I spent a lot of time on the streets with outreach teams. Yesterday I was walking the Los Angeles River, talking to folks who are living in tents, hearing their lived experience, trying to take my power as mayor saying, this is the day you should come home. You should go out of homelessness. And we went from 9,000 people being housed a year to 21,300 last year. Now, if you told me that 4 years ago, I'd say we're on our way home to solving homelessness. You all are public policy folks. It's rare to get that kind of success where in a short period of time you can double that. Put on top of those 21,000, 27,000 that found their own way out of homelessness. So last year, 48,000 real people in the county of Los Angeles moved from homelessness into homes. But 54,000 new people went into homelessness. So when we see an increase, it's not that the success isn't working, it's that we don't have the scale and we're not preventing it from happening in the first place. Second point, federal government has to be a part of this, and I know I'm preaching to the converted with the four of you. But back in the 80s when the federal government started to step up on homelessness, when I was first becoming an activist on this, it made a difference. We calculated between state cuts, which aren't the responsibility of the folks from Texas here, nor our members of Congress here, but state cuts, which got rid of our redevelopment dollars, and federal cuts to our affordable housing dollars, we calculated this, $20 billion of affordable housing over the last decade disappeared. In other words, if we had just kept the level of funding from 10 years ago, about 20,000 people worth of housing would have been put in LA County, enough for us not to have gone up, but probably to have reduced homelessness. I see the red lights on, so I'll try to wrap things up, but let me leave you with two things. This is a public health crisis. New data that just came out said those that are unhoused versus those that are in shelter, those that are out on the streets versus those in the shelters, are 25 times more likely to have triple morbidity of substance abuse, mental health, and physical health problems. If we think this is only a housing problem, we need to make sure that the health issues are there. Second, when the federal government stepped up for our veterans, here in Los Angeles, we housed more homeless veterans than anywhere in the country. We had more to begin with, but we reduced by 80% the number of veterans. In fact, we've housed double the number than we started with. We just are the 20% left because of the new folks that are coming out onto the street every single day. And third, we have to look at prevention. It is time to pass Maxine Waters' Ending Homelessness Act now. Now. And I'll say this last thing to our president, because you invoked our commander-in-chief. I retired from the Navy, so he's not in my chain of command militarily anymore. But when he was in Japan recently, he said a few words about this city and San Francisco. He said the streets were so clean in Tokyo, nobody was homeless. He said, it's disgusting, or whatever words he used, in my city and in San Francisco. And he said he might have to do something about it. He said this problem started 2 years ago. In my response, and I know we're just supposed to punch our political opponents back, I didn't. I said any day the commander-in-chief of this country is talking about homelessness is an opportunity and a good day. And I said, if he's really willing to come to Skid Row and walk that walk, maybe not spend a night, but walk that walk, or have us come to the White House and bring a coalition of independent Republican and Democratic mayors who struggle with this issue across America, and he wants to save lives, we'll call his bluff on that, and we'll say, we can save lives together. I told him this problem didn't start 2 years ago when he became president, and didn't start 6 years ago when I became mayor. This has been the legacy of too many decades of neglect, but it is on our watch to end it, and Washington, D.C. must and will, with your success, be a part of that solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes to raise a few questions with you. I am very pleased about your support of my legislation. And we developed this legislation understanding that $13 billion was going to raise some eyebrows. But we believe if we're to end homelessness, we've got to put the resources to apply to the problem. And so, having said that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your budget. In addition to the federal money that you receive from Washington, D.C., and the grants that we give to all of the states and cities, there was an initiative that was passed, I believe it was HHH,
correct,
where you received additional resources. And I know that you've put those resources to work. I'm interested in one aspect of that right now, and that is the transitional housing.
Yes.
Which I think is extremely exciting, and you showed us an example of it on the screen. And I want to know, how many have you developed?
Yes.
How many are you going to develop? And will that include South Central or South Los Angeles?
Absolutely it will, including in your district, Congresswoman. So it's interesting you talk about the $13 billion, which shouldn't raise eyebrows. It's a sad commentary when we think $13 billion will raise eyebrows when the city and county together through measures HHH and H have raised about $4.5 billion in housing money and services money. And we're 3% of the nation's population. If you do the math, we should have $120 billion just to match what we've raised locally. So your ambition is not only impressive, it should be looked at as a start, because if you match just what LA has done, the federal government would be putting $120 billion. Now, not every community has homelessness equal to ours, so if you looked at the homeless population, maybe it would be 40 or 50. But yes, we have two measures that passed. HHH is for Los Angeles City itself, the largest housing measure in U.S. history to pass by a vote of the voters. It leverages about $5 billion worth of housing from people looking at shipping containers and new innovative ways to do it cheaper and faster, to traditional, really beautifully built apartments for folks that have the deepest need and perhaps sometimes the triple diagnosis that I mentioned before and will need to have services for the rest of their lives. We have 110 projects of permanent housing, and on the transitional housing side, we have 25 transitional housing shelters that we are looking to open up in this next 12 months, 4 of which are already open. In South Los Angeles, we have, I would say, almost a preponderance of those, including in the former animal services yard next to where we had a unused kind of dog park. It is going to be opening up in about a month and a half. We have a group of engineers, architects, builders, who almost like a war room manage, and we can get up in 60 days, span tents right now, that have cubicles where people can have their own beds. It's a new model where people can bring their pets, their partners, and their property, which is why people have been shelter resistant in the past. And my personal wish, though we don't know where the money will come from, though if this passes we could, is to double the number to about 50. That would give us, at that point, somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 beds, which would turn over every, let's say, 6 months or so. So you're looking at every year, almost 9,000 to 10,000 people being served. Put that a few years, and we could not only make a dent in homelessness, we might have a chance of ending street homelessness in LA.
Thank you very much. I was interviewed on KJLH day before yesterday, I believe, and Dominique DePrima, who you're familiar with, had an idea, and I told her I would share it with you.
Great.
She thinks that you should buy up some of the motels that are problematic in the community and convert those into housing. And she didn't identify whether it's transitional or permanent supportive housing or what have you, but I thought it was a pretty good idea, particularly if those motels are presenting us with a problem that causes you to have to use resources to respond to complaints and violence or any of that. Is that something that you've thought about or you can do, or what would you tell Dominique DePrima?
Well, I would always say, Dominique, you're one of the smartest people I know, and all of her ideas are good. We are moving on motels. We need a little bit of state help to change the residency, that there's a maximum of 29 days so that we can take existing motels today and just do leases on them while we are looking for money to buy motels. Now, we have to get the owners to do it. Where we've had problematic ones, there are far and few between that they're ready to seize. But absolutely, that is part of it. We've, in fact, had tens of millions of dollars lined up through the Salvation Army and some other folks to do just that. And those monies unfortunately fell through for the developer that was going to do this, but we will not be deterred. I think those motels are a twofer, get rid of blight, and at the same time have a great place to put housing right now. So we do expect a number of those. San Fernando Valley, there's some in South LA as well, in the next 12 months or so to come online.
Well, you certainly have a friend in Governor Newsom.
Yes, we do.
Who is doing everything that he can to be of help. With that, I will recognize Representative Sherman for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you.
Hello,
Mr.
Representative.
Mayor, thanks for being here. Thanks for your dedication to this problem. We pass a lot of laws in Congress. We repeal some, but we cannot repeal the law of supply and demand.
Yes.
We need more units. We especially need more rental units. It's best if we can get the construction of affordable units. Even if we get luxury units built, somebody's moving in there that would otherwise be in a non-luxury unit. I want to focus on the fiscalization of land use planning, where a system for financing government, and government needs money, but it's important how you raise the money. If you want to build an auto dealership, I got a dozen cities in this county that will give you free land.
Yep.
And the mayor will come in and help you not just cut the ribbon, he'll help you build.
Yep.
And on the other hand, if you want to build housing, you pay an impact fee. And you may have seen the headline in the Los Angeles Times, one reason housing is so expensive in California, cities, counties charge high developer fees. So what do we do so that we finance government based on ability to pay, which the state income tax being a good way to measure that, and instead we finance based upon whether you're building something that the city government has to provide police and fire protection for.
Absolutely. Well, as somebody who led on tax policy on the Board of Equalization and a tax lawyer, it's a great question from you, Representative. A couple things. One, between impact fees, and I do believe, and we passed, after 40 years after Tom Bradley first proposed it, we did pass a linkage fee, which says if you're building luxury housing, just like we do for parks and other things, you do have to put money aside for affordable housing. And I think that we'll raise as much as $100 million or $100 million worth of subsidized low-income housing out of that with the building boom we're having. But you're right, you can't keep putting everything on developers. But between getting nothing done by having no fees on them and having fees is something in between that enough cities don't use, which is the power of zoning. It doesn't cost you anything, but it can produce more housing, and then you can ask for something in exchange.
At a minimum, I hope you would join me, and this is a state matter, in trying to get the sales tax that's generated by building, because you have all the,
materials.
The building materials allocated to the city where the building takes place, rather than where the warehouse for the building supplies is located. I do want to point out that we're focused on homeless, but I think there was general agreement before you got here. The rents are too damn high.
Yes.
And it's not just for the homeless.
Correct.
The homeless is the tip of the iceberg, and the homeless we see is the tip of that iceberg. But for every homeless person, there are so many that could get evicted tomorrow. And they may never get evicted, but they're losing stomach lining today because they could be evicted tomorrow. There are people cutting back on their medicines. There are people going to payday lenders to be able to make there are people that are 1 month delinquent and paying a late fee, and they'll somehow stay in their unit. And we have to do everything possible to build more housing, and the more affordable that housing is, the better. I want to focus, you and I think are going to be together in Chatsworth tomorrow, where there was the old LA Times plant.
Yep.
And now it's going to be in part housing. And you had to sweep aside some problems for that to happen because the land was zoned industrial. But what can we do on a systemic level to make sure that if you want to build affordable housing and rentable housing, you can do it regardless of zoning restrictions? I can see that you might not want one unit in among a bunch of factories, but what can be done to say yes to those who want to build rental housing?
Well, that's where I was headed.
Without the mayor having to intervene in the
Of course, and it shouldn't require political leadership because mayors change and councils change and things like that. So we've changed the zoning. We're investing in 15 new rail lines in Los Angeles, the biggest program of a city in U.S. history, thanks also to the voters with Measure M. What we started doing already along those transit lines, and there'll be one in the Northwest San Fernando Valley around CSUN, is we've said if you are close to transit and genuinely big transit stops.
Let me point out, in other parts of the city, you're close to a subway or rails or grade-separated rail. Only in the San Fernando Valley do you call it transit because you have a bus stop. But we'll talk about that one later.
Well, you and I have, and that we made sure that the valley where I'm from was not written out of that this last time. So we look forward to equitable treatment there. But what we've done is we said if you can go higher and denser around transit if you build affordable housing on your own dime. It's not a linkage fee, so it's not additional cost, it's additional opportunity and additional benefit. And half of the housing now in Los Angeles City is coming through this one change, fully half of it. And Los Angeles is building 75% of all the housing in LA County, and we're just 40% of the population. So your point about those neighboring cities and towns, nobody can afford to say no and then say, where does homelessness come from if you're not willing to build housing in your own neighborhoods and affordable housing as well. And to your rent piece as well, at the state level, I hope that the state legislature will pass, and I know the governor will sign 1482, which is an anti-rent gouging ordinance, which says you cannot raise rents 25 to 50%. I do want to put in one other thing. We may or may not get split roll, but if we get split roll, it's got to be tied to ending fees, at least for rental housing. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the mayor for appearing.
Thank you.
Mayor, for simply edification purposes, while you may appear to be alone, it's happening in Houston.
Yes.
It is in Washington, D.C., and the numbers are growing for various and sundry reasons. One question for me to take to my constituents and persons that are interested in this in an acute way would be, what can we do to prevent, while we are not where you are, but we're headed in your direction, what should we do now to take preventive measures?
Three things, and thank you for that question. Restore at least to previous levels the housing funding from the federal government and pass this measure that Chairwoman Waters put forward. Second, put up assistance for eviction, legal assistance. Fund that. We're doing that out of dollars we don't really even have, but I know Representative Garcia talked about being a legal aid lawyer. We're seeing most landlords are good, but the unscrupulous ones have a disproportionately bad impact on your neighborhoods, and so we're giving legal assistance to folks who are threatened with eviction, often who face language barriers and poverty barriers and other things. And three, have a mental health system that isn't stage 4 intervention. If we really want to understand the folks on the street, not the people in the cars necessarily in the shelters who are equally struggling could become those folks on the street, but with the deep mental health needs, we wait till somebody's stage 4, and if the 4 of us came into the emergency room with a substance abuse issue or a deep mental health problem, I bet none of the 4 of us would be seen, maybe one. If 4 of us come in with broken legs, we will be treated anywhere in America. It is reprehensible that in this country at this time, we wait till we are basically at stage 4. And as you said, people are dying on our streets before we intervene with the right to mental health care in this city. When I walked that river yesterday, 9 out of 10, if not 10 out of 10 of the people I spoke to, you could just see, have mental health problems that are going untreated. And if you expect this just to be cleaned up by a bunch of folks who are going to bring either police officers or sanitation workers, that ain't going to happen. It has to be that at the same time we put housing in. And what I didn't finish with the president, I found this out, that in Japan, where he said homelessness doesn't exist, it did a few years ago. A lot of seniors were homeless on the streets, treated terribly in Japan. They were ashamed of it and shuttled away. And guess what the Japanese federal government did? They put forward housing assistance and income assistance, and there are not homeless people on those streets of Japan anymore. This is about putting those resources in place on mental health, on income, and treating these things earlier.
Thank you, Mayor. Additional question. I don't want you to just put yourself at risk by answering this question, but if you had the resources, you've mentioned resources, what are we talking about and over what period of time?
Yeah.
If you had the necessary resources, how much, and then over what period of time before you would give us what results?
Look, in 4 years, I remind people that those of us that are veterans are not different from non-veterans. We're as diverse as the non-veteran population. And that in 4 years we could reduce by 80% the veteran population in all of our complexity shows that if we had the resources, you could make a sizable dent in 5 years and you could end street homelessness in 10. But will people have the will to do that? And back to the Marshall Plan, will we build something to never let this happen again? So that when we see that day in Los Angeles and Houston and other places where homelessness comes down, will we have a system to catch people early? The mental health indicators, people being released from prison, there's a great federal changes, but is there a plan for these people? I say that in all seriousness because here in California, those of us who supported criminal justice reform, we saw a lot of people come out of our jails and prisons, but there was nobody to meet them and greet them and train them for a job and give them a substance abuse or mental health counseling they needed. So if they were in prison because they had a gram of something too much and went away for 20 years, they've never had that problem dealt with, and 3 weeks later, they're using again on the streets and they're living in a tent, and they might be breaking into cars to feed that habit. We can do better, so it's also put that in place, but I think a decade is what we're talking about.
Finally, this is probably at a different level for us to take up perhaps at a later time, but we have a circumstance wherein about 1% of the people hold about 40% of the wealth. Yes. The top 20%, 90% of the wealth. And I marvel at how we have been conditioned to believe that this is normal, this is the way it should be, that people at the very top should have enough wealth such that they alone could fund solutions. Mayor, I'm not going to ask you to get into the distribution of wealth, but
always happy to do that.
But with the top 20% holding 90% of the wealth, yep. Is this a factor in this homelessness problem, many others as well, but in the homelessness problem?
Unquestionably. This is the biggest income gap and the biggest wealth gap we have had since the Great Depression. I say that as often as I can because this second Gilded Age feels like a lot of fun if you're doing well. There's never been a better time to be in cities in terms of the culture and the museums and the food and everything else. But even the successful cities have a deep underclass, and the other cities are being completely left behind. That is not what this country is. It is not who we are. When people get scared about redistribution, I always say, forget about what's being taken away. What's the cost to you to drive through your own city and to see people living on the sidewalks and in tents? What's the cost to you when you tell me, your mayor, to clean that up, $50,000 a person at a time, and we won't do something to control our rents or do something to give people a little bit of assistance for 6 months so they can make that rent? That is what is perversely wrong in this moment. But I appreciate your voice and the voice of these members to make sure that we don't forget there are structural reasons that we have a homelessness problem in Los Angeles and across this nation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Mayor, for coming. Your presence here today is a strong indicator of your concerns and your sentiments on this issue. I want to focus on something that several of the other speakers talked about, but no question has really come up that directly addresses it. I've had some real concerns, even in my own city, about the criminalization of homelessness. In addition to being from the same city and both being lawyers, my colleague and I here at the table, both are former judges. And in lower jurisdiction courts, he saw a lot of landlord-tenant cases. I saw a lot of what I call, tickets that are criminalizing behavior that really need to be addressed with proper treatment and care. And when I look at what some cities have done in having ordinances against camping or sleeping in cars or feeding of folks at public spaces, taking property that they have with them, there's just, I can go on and on. I just don't see where that gets us. And quite frankly, I don't like hardly any of these at all. I don't think that it solves any problem. I think it just creates more because all you're doing is, incarcerating them. They stay there a little while, then they go back, and it's back to the same situation. I was raised Catholic, and I was told very early on in my growing ages that, we're all God's children. I was also taught that to follow the golden rule, do unto others as you want them to do unto you. I ask you the question quite candidly, and I hope don't take offense, but if you lost your job today and lost your house and lost everything and became homeless, would this be the way you would want to be treated, to get a ticket because you're sleeping in a car, or not be able to just have your own space somewhere that you can call your own?
That's right. No, of course not. And thank you, Representative Garcia. First of all, welcome to LA. There's a double heartbreak going on. There's a double heartbreak that's going on right now. One is the number. One is the number of people.
Please refrain from interfering with the testimony.
The double heartbreak is, one, seeing so many people who are brothers and sisters on the streets and in cars and in shelters. The second is the loss of public...
I'm sorry, I'm really having trouble. Could you
Sure.
speak closer?
There's a double heartbreak that's going on in many of American cities, and I think Los Angeles is one. First and foremost, it's the just sheer number of people that are now living on the streets, in cars, and in shelters. But second is also, I think...
Right, but how does giving them a ticket solve
No, I'm
the
going to get to
problem?
that. I hear you loud and clear. But the second one is the death of public space in many communities, where there's a second heartbreak that goes on every time somebody comes off of an off-ramp or walks through a park or is on the sidewalk. I do agree with you. And we are looking at an amnesty of all of those low offenses that have been built up through past administrations and past years of those infractions here in Los Angeles.
Well, if you give them amnesty, that means they still stay on the books.
No, it would, and to expunge.
So you would actually repeal all
Correct.
those ordinances?
And that's what I would like to see be done.
And when would, excuse me, Mayor, but when would that be done?
Well, our city attorney is a independently elected individual, so we're working with the city attorney's office, but to me it can't happen soon enough. And our police chief has announced that as well, so it has the backing of our police department, which I think we're the largest city in America to have said that and to have done that. So we're ready to go as soon as our city attorney and the court system is ready to go too.
Right. Now, you're the city that had the ordinance also on taking property that I guess somebody's decided people don't need to be carrying around or have with them. And if property was taken, do you all keep track of that and return it to them? And if you do, at what time?
We'd invite you to the storage centers that we have and the need that we have for many more. But downtown, we have probably the largest storage center in America for individuals who are experiencing homelessness. They get a ticket. It's efficient. That is their property. We keep it for them. They don't have to worry about it getting stolen on the street. They can take it out any time of day or night. They're able to go and have that and know that it is safe and secure. And we've said we cannot begin to do that, and the courts have agreed with this. You can't take people's properties. By the way, we can never take their critical property.
You're talking about due process, and I might note, Mayor, that behind you there's a couple of people that are shaking their heads that that's not true.
No, and they're right. I would not say that there have not been mistakes in the past or that everybody is perfect even today when you talk about the tens of thousands of interactions that happen. My goal is to bring that as close to zero as possible because that's the standard we need to have. Second, a lot of communities, just like they say no to shelters, say no to even storage centers. So the difficulty of just finding the sheer number of places to do that and the expense to do it when there's no funding for this and you have to figure out a way to fund it, they're very expensive to run in the millions of dollars a year just to do the storage. Third is ideally you have the storage where people are. So the new model that the chairwoman asked me about of where we're having shelters in the communities where people are homeless, where you can bring your pets and your property and your partners, it's that second piece that's absolutely critical. People aren't going to come off the street if they can't bring their stuff. Now at the other end, we do have to all say there isn't an unlimited amount of space ever, that when we have homelessness workers who are coming to us complaining that they can't get to and from work because sometimes the single individual's belongings are as wide as this entire table, we have to be able to make that a services-led, not law enforcement, interaction to reduce the amount of space that somebody has so that folks can get to and from the services they need to have, so that people don't become cocooned. And I will say one last thing, for serious crimes, and if you want to get deep into this, for the encampments that happen, there are people who prey on the folks that are there, who set up shop, who are the serious drug dealers, who are folks who are raping people in tents, and people's unhoused status should not ever shield you from accountability for serious crimes. And so we can't go so far also that we kind of back off completely of any police presence to protect the very same people who are themselves going through the deepest of traumas.
Now, certainly I'm not talking about any serious crimes. I'm talking to what I call some of the things that a lot of cities are doing to target the homeless to, quote, get them off the street and not be seen, especially in downtown areas. And again, I've seen that even in my own city.
Sure.
But my concern was when I read the memo that the committee gave us was seeing that in this city it had increased by 31% since 2011. That's really significant.
No, that number is because for the first time I demanded we track those. It's not comparing apples to apples. It's for the first time we're actually counting them. So it was counting it with years in which we barely counted or didn't even count. I now wanted to know code every single time there is something that's happening to or by somebody who's experiencing homelessness so that we can have those numbers. In the coming years, we'll be able to compete, but it has not gone up 31%.
So are any services provided while they're in jail to kind of help them transition or help them?
In my opinion, no. And the cities don't. We do have small lockup facilities, but the jails are the county and state and prisons, the state's responsibilities. Absolutely not enough. And if we want to solve homelessness, I think a big part of that small sliver of criminal activity that's happening among people who are unhoused is happening because people are coming out of the jails and prisons without a plan. The savings we were promised by the criminal justice reforms that would go to local government, and instead of putting folks in a prison system, we don't see.
All right, one final question. So if we could put a package together or to add to address this specific issue to again, I fail to see why cities even do it, but to help you to make sure that you didn't have to criminalize homelessness, what would that one thing be other than funding?
Well, we need storage, for sure.
Storage?
I don't know, other than funding, if there is anything that the federal government has the power to do or that we'd want. We need money to be able to create the systems where people can store their goods. Training for law enforcement officials and city officials who do this. We think we have now some of the best practices. We've been meeting with advocates, and from their suggestions, have a different regime. It used to be led by 6 or 7 police officers and then sanitation officials, and it was the wrong message. It was traumatic for people on the streets. Now it's led by people with lived experience, mental health professionals, and people who are even giving trash bags to folks. We're paying 20 people. We just launched 20 people who are themselves experiencing homelessness with jobs to clean up around the areas where they are unhoused. So to empower them with job experience, with some income. They want to clean up, and they say, give us the trash bags, let us have the training. So those sorts of things help, but I don't know if it doesn't come without money, any of them.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I yield back. Thank you,
Thank you.
Madam Chair, for your indulgence on the overtime.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the mayor for his valuable time and all of our witnesses from today's hearing for their testimony today. All members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. All members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And before adjourning, I'd like to recognize from Watts Century Latino Organization, Arturo Ybarra, the Executive Director. Thank you, Arturo, for being here. Also, Reverend Reginald Pope, Bethel Missionary Baptist Church. He is one of the leaders in the Watts ministers. He had to leave, but give him a big round of applause anyway. And of course, last but not least, someone that we all know as an advocate on everything, Big Money Griff is here. This hearing is adjourned.